Yo! Welcome to Vision. Harry got an absolute banger for you today. Flitwick found 31 illegal bindings on Harry's magic. He reported to the ICW, not Dumbledore. Like, subscribe, comment below. Let's go. Chapter 1, The Diagnosis. The diagnostic charm was supposed to take 30 seconds. Flitwick had run it 100 times before, a simple sweep, the kind he performed on every first year in the opening weeks of term to check for latent magical blocks, learning impediments, the occasional hereditary curse that a family had been quietly ignoring for 3 generations. It was administrative work, really. Dull, necessary, the magical equivalent of a doctor checking reflexes. He'd set up a corner of his classroom after hours, a low chair, a recording quill, and he'd call them in one at a time during the lunch break on Thursdays. Most took 30 seconds. Some interesting ones. Hermione Granger had taken nearly 2 minutes, her core so dense and layered with potential that the diagnostic wand had trembled, took a minute or 2. Harry Potter took 11 minutes, and by the end of it, Flitwick was standing very still with his wand at his side and his expression arranged very carefully into nothing at all. He waited until Harry left the room. The boy had sat in the chair with his hands in his lap, looking vaguely curious, asking once if it was supposed to tickle, and Flitwick had said, quite normal, in a tone he'd had to concentrate to keep level. Harry had gone back to lunch. The door had clicked shut behind him. Flitwick looked at the results scroll for a long time. 31. He counted again. He counted a third time, leaning close enough that his nose was nearly touching the parchment. He even cast the diagnostic a second time on the results scroll itself, just to confirm there hadn't been some cascading error in the recording charm. 31 separate magical bindings, layered over Harry Potter's core like bandages wrapped around a fire. Some of them were old, placed when the boy was an infant, the magical signature faded and compressed with time. Some were newer, a handful dating to roughly a year ago, crisp and deliberate. They were not all the same work. He could tell that immediately. A skilled charms master could read a magical signature the way a conductor reads a score, not just what it was doing, but how it had been constructed, the characteristic rhythms of whoever had written it. Several of the signatures he recognized. That was the part that made him stand very still. He rolled the parchment up with hands that did not shake, because Phileas Flitwick had once dueled 23 consecutive opponents at the European Wizarding Championship and he understood the difference between feeling afraid and showing it. He tucked the scroll into his inner robe pocket, cast a locking charm on the classroom door, and sat down in his own chair, the tall stool behind his desk that leveled him out to a reasonable height. He sat there for a long time, thinking. The obvious thing, the expected thing, the thing that Hogwarts protocol absolutely mandated, was to bring something like this to the headmaster. Unusual findings regarding a student's magical core. Potential evidence of external interference with a student's magical development. That was Dumbledore's purview. That was the chain of command. Flitwick thought about the signatures on that scroll. He thought about them for a very long time. Then he thought about a boy sitting in that chair with his hands in his lap, asking if it was supposed to tickle, completely unaware that every single thing he'd ever done with magic, every spell, every accidental burst, every moment in his first 11 years where something inexplicable happened, had been filtered through 31 layers of deliberate suppression. He thought about what Harry Potter's magic would look like without those bindings. He thought about the fact that some of those signatures belonged to a man who had access to Harry Potter every single day of his life here at Hogwarts. Flitwick got up, walked to his desk, and began composing a letter. Not to Albus Dumbledore. Not to Minerva McGonagall. Not to the Board of Governors. He wrote to the International Confederation of Wizards, Department of Magical Child Welfare and Core Integrity, Geneva office. He wrote clearly and precisely and without editorializing, because that was how you made something irrefutable. He listed each binding, its estimated date of placement, its structural composition as best he could analyze, and the signatures he had identified. He attached a sealed, magically notarized copy of the diagnostic results, impossible to forge or alter after the fact, and he signed his full name with his credentials, Phileas Flitwick, Master of Charms, First Class, European Dueling Champion 1961 to 1964, currently employed Charms Professor, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He did not seal the letter with the school crest. He sealed it with his personal seal, which he had not used in 15 years. He tied it to his personal owl, not the school post, never the school post, and sent it out the high window of his office at 2:17 in the morning. Then he went to bed, and lay awake until dawn. The owl returned by the following evening with a reply that was 4 sentences long. Professor Flitwick. Your report has been received and reviewed at the senior level. An investigative delegation will arrive at Hogwarts within 48 hours. Please do not discuss this matter with Headmaster Dumbledore or any Hogwarts staff prior to our arrival. V. Ionescu, Senior Investigator, ICW Department of Magical Child Welfare. 4 sentences. 48 hours. No preamble, no bureaucratic hedging. Flitwick had expected forms to fill out. He'd expected to be told that an inquiry had been opened and that someone would be in touch in due course. He'd expected the kind of polite institutional delay that made real problems die quietly. The reply told him they'd read his letter very carefully and that whatever was in it had made someone senior move fast. He burned the reply in his fireplace, kept the notarized copy of the diagnostic locked in his personal warded safe, and went about teaching the next day with every appearance of normality. He taught first years how to make a feather levitate. He gently corrected wrist movements. He gave Hermione Granger a small, genuine smile when she got it perfectly on the 4th attempt, and he watched Harry Potter on the other side of the room get it right on the 7th, and he thought about what 3 attempts might have looked like. Harry caught him looking at some point during the class and gave him a slightly puzzled half-smile. Flitwick smiled back, nodded, moved on. 42 hours after he sent his owl, they arrived. Flitwick was in his classroom after dinner when the floof flared green and 3 people stepped through in rapid succession, each one moving with the practiced ease of people who had stepped through a lot of floof in their professional lives. The first was a tall man with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of being professionally unimpressed, sharp dark eyes, a hawkish nose, a mouth set in a line that suggested smiling was something he reserved for special occasions. He wore deep burgundy robes with the ICW crest stitched at the breast in silver thread, and he looked around Flitwick's classroom with a systematic, taking inventory sort of gaze. Behind him came a woman, shorter, stocky, with close-cropped hair and reading glasses perched on her head that she clearly didn't need for distance. She carried a leather satchel that clinked faintly, the sound of diagnostic instruments. The third was a young man who said nothing, took out a small notebook the moment his feet hit the floor, and appeared to immediately begin documenting the room. Professor Flitwick. The tall man extended a hand. His accent was precise, each word given its full weight. Vasile Ionescu. I have reviewed your diagnostic report in full. I expected more forms, Flitwick said honestly. Something shifted in Ionescu's expression. Not quite a smile. When a report contains the signatures you documented, Professor, there are no forms. There is only speed. He turned slightly. This is Dr. Petra Vass, our core integrity specialist from Budapest. And that is my junior associate, Mr. Reyes. You can ignore him, he is writing everything down and will continue to do so regardless of what anyone says. Mr. Reyes did not look up from his notebook. I need to understand something before we proceed, Flitwick said. He'd rehearsed this part. I reported to you rather than the headmaster because of what I found in those signatures. I want to be very clear about what I'm alleging and what I'm not alleging, because a mistake here, you identified at minimum 4 bindings bearing structural signatures consistent with the work of Albus Dumbledore, Ionescu said. Not a question. You identified several more consistent with an unidentified second party. You identified one consistent with what you believe to be the remnant signature of Lord Voldemort. He said the name without hesitation, without the flinch Flitwick had noticed even in himself for years. And the remaining bindings were placed by parties unknown, through methods you could not immediately classify. Yes. You were correct not to bring this to Dumbledore. Ionescu said it simply. If you had brought it to him and he is complicit, the evidence would have disappeared before morning. The child might have been removed from the situation before we could act. And you, Professor, would have found yourself in a very uncomfortable position for a very long time. He paused. You did the right thing. Flitwick had been holding some tension in his chest since 2 in the morning 2 nights ago that he hadn't fully acknowledged until Ionescu said that, and he breathed out once through his nose. When do you want to see him? He asked. Tomorrow morning. Before classes. I would prefer he have no warning, and I would strongly prefer that Headmaster Dumbledore not know we are here until we have already spoken to the boy. Ionescu's dark eyes were steady. Is that manageable? I'll arrange it. Harry had been summoned by Professor Flitwick's messenger spell, a small silver charm shaped like a bird that had appeared at the Gryffindor breakfast table and whispered 7:30, my classroom, come alone in Flitwick's distinctive high voice. He'd assumed he'd done something wrong in class, though he couldn't think what. He ran through his recent charms work as he walked, decided his Wingardium Leviosa had been fine, and went down the corridor still half thinking about it when he pushed open the classroom door and found 3 strangers in burgundy robes standing next to Professor Flitwick, all of them looking at him with very focused attention. He stopped in the doorway. Come in, Harry, Flitwick said. His voice was normal. His expression was something more complicated. Shut the door. Harry shut the door and stood with his back to it for a moment, looking at the 3 strangers. The tall one looked like someone who investigated things. The woman with the glasses pushed up on her head was watching him the way a Medowitch had once watched him when he was 7 and Mrs. Fig had brought him in after he'd fallen off his bike, professional, measured, quietly cataloguing. The young man in the corner was writing in a notebook. Harry, Flitwick said carefully, these are colleagues from the International Confederation of Wizards. They've come because of what I found when I ran your diagnostic last week. The tickling thing. Yes. Flitwick cleared his throat. Harry, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound alarming. I want you to hear all of it before you react, if you can manage that. Harry looked at him. Something in Flitwick's careful steadiness told him this was not a small thing. All right, he said. During your diagnostic, I found 31 magical bindings placed on your core. The room was very quiet. 31, Harry said. Yes. Harry turned this over in his head. He had been in the wizarding world for just under 2 months. He was still learning the vocabulary. Bindings like what? Like a block. Like 31 blocks, Ionescu said, stepping forward. Each one suppressing a different aspect of your magical ability. Some are very old, placed when you were a small child. Some are more recent. He paused. Mr. Potter, do you understand what I'm saying? Your magical core, the full extent of what you are capable of, has never once expressed itself freely in your life. Harry stood in front of the door and did not say anything for a moment. He thought about 11 years of strange things happening around him, a snake talking back, hair growing overnight, ending up on the school roof to escape Dudley's gang, and how those things had always felt like pressure escaping from something. A lid rattling on a pot. Who put them there, he said. Ionescu looked at him with something that might have been respect. Not how do I get them off, not am I going to be okay, straight to who did this. That is what we are here to determine fully, the investigator said. We have some preliminary answers. We do not yet have all of them. Can you tell me the preliminary ones? Ionescu glanced at Flitwick. Flitwick gave a small nod. Several of the bindings bear the magical signature of Albus Dumbledore, Ionescu said. Harry absorbed this the way he absorbed most things that were difficult, very still, very quiet, and then a small, slow exhale. He looked at Flitwick. And you didn't tell him you were bringing them here? No. Smart. Harry said it simply, without any particular heat. He looked back at Ionescu. What happens now? What happened next was Dr. Vass, who had been quietly unpacking her leather satchel during this conversation, asking Harry to sit in the examination chair and running a comprehensive scan that made the room smell faintly of copper and ozone. She spoke in short, precise sentences, asked him to breathe deeply at certain points, and occasionally made sounds that weren't quite words but clearly meant something to Ionescu, who was watching from the corner with his arms folded. She confirmed Flitwick's count. 31. She also confirmed something Flitwick hadn't been certain of, that removing them all at once would be inadvisable. Harry's core had grown up around these bindings the way a tree grows around wire. Too fast, and the sudden restructuring could cause feedback damage. We stagger the removal, she said, sitting back and pulling off a pair of thin diagnostic gloves. 10 at a time, with intervals in between. The first 10 are the least complex, placement bindings, mostly. They suppress raw output but don't touch the structural composition of his core. Removing those will be safe to do today. Today, Harry said. If you consent. She held his gaze. This is entirely your choice, Mr. Potter. We remove nothing without your explicit agreement, not a single one. Harry looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the satchel, the instruments, the notebook, Flitwick's carefully neutral face. What does it feel like when you remove them? Pressure releasing. Some people describe it as warmth. Some describe disorientation for a few hours afterward as the core adjusts. You may feel more than usual. She paused. Or you may feel significantly more than usual, given how many are present. Do it, Harry said. The removal of the first 10 bindings took 40 minutes. Dr. Vass worked with the focused precision of someone diffusing something delicate, and Harry sat in the chair and watched the ceiling and said nothing except once, about halfway through, when he said, "Oh," in a voice that was soft and slightly startled, like someone had quietly opened a window in a room that had been sealed for years. When it was done, he sat still for a moment. Then he raised one hand, pointed at a spare quill on Flitwick's desk across the room, and it flew to him with a speed and precision that made Flitwick step back involuntarily. It wasn't the force of it, it was the lack of effort. No wand. No word. Just a gesture and a quill moving as if it had always been waiting for permission. Harry looked at the quill in his hand. Then at his hand. "Ha," he said. "Yes," said Dr. Vass, writing something in her own notes with complete composure. That would be wandless telekinetic projection. Moderately advanced. Most adult wizards cannot do that with any reliability. I'm 11. I know. Harry turned the quill over in his fingers. What else can't I do because of the other 21? We'll know more after each removal, she said. But Mr. Potter, she paused, and something in her professional manner softened fractionally. Based on what I can see of your core's underlying structure, I want you to be prepared for the fact that your full magical range may be considerably beyond what we currently have reference points for. Is that a problem? For you? No. She started packing her instruments back into the satchel. For some other people? Possibly. She didn't elaborate, and her tone suggested she didn't need to. Dumbledore found out at 9:47 in the morning, when Ionescu knocked on the door of his office and presented credentials. Flitwick wasn't there for that meeting, but he heard about it secondhand from Minerva, who had been in the outer office when Ionescu and Mr. Reyes walked past with an expression that she described, later and in private, as the face of someone who absolutely does not need to be invited in. What she could tell him was that Dumbledore had been in that meeting for 2 hours. That when he emerged, his expression was composed in a way she recognized. It was the face he wore when he was doing his fastest thinking underneath absolute stillness. And that he had looked at her when he passed her in the corridor and said, very mildly, "I imagine Phileas has had quite a week," and she hadn't known what to say, so she'd said nothing. Flitwick also heard from Ionescu himself that evening, in a brief meeting in his office. He admitted to placing 4 bindings, Ionescu said, without sitting down. He stood in the center of the room with his hands clasped behind his back, delivering the information like a report. He characterized them as protective in nature. He said they were placed with the boy's best interests in mind, given the nature of the prophecy and the risk that Harry's full magical ability, uncontrolled and visible, would attract Voldemort's attention before he was ready to face him. Flitwick sat in his chair and looked up at the investigator. And it is the most elegant, internally coherent, morally sophisticated defense of child abuse I have ever heard in 30 years of doing this work. Ionescu's voice didn't change at all. It is also still child abuse, and it is still illegal under 12 separate ICW statutes, and his reasoning does not matter. What happens to him? That is above my authority to determine. What is within my authority is this. Ionescu reached into his coat and produced a folded document. As of this morning, I have filed an emergency injunction with the ICW placing Harry Potter under the formal protection of this investigation. What that means, practically speaking, is that no binding, ward, suppression, or modification of any kind may be placed on his person or his magical core without his written consent and my countersignature. Albus Dumbledore may not remove him from this school, may not transfer custody, may not have any private meeting with the boy without a neutral observer present. He set the document on Flitwick's desk. I am also, Ionescu continued, filing a notification with the British Ministry of Magic. Specifically, with the head of magical law enforcement. A Madam Bones, I believe. Amelia, Flitwick said. Amelia Bones. Yes. He thought about this. She'll come herself. Good, said Ionescu. I was hoping she would. Harry spent most of that Wednesday in a state he didn't quite have words for. The best he could manage was loud. Not loud as in noise, the castle was the same as always, the Gryffindor common room was the usual tangle of voices and homework and someone always playing Exploding Snap. But he felt loud inside, like someone had turned up a dial he hadn't known existed. Colors were sharper at the edges. He could feel the ambient magic of the castle the way you could feel heat from a fireplace, a kind of textured presence at the edge of his awareness. He kept picking up objects without meaning to. A book slid off Ron's bag and into his hand before he'd consciously reached for it, and Ron had stared at him, and Harry had said, "Sorry, here," and handed it back, and Ron had given him the look of someone recalibrating. In herbology, Professor Sprout had them working with some mildly aggressive fanged geraniums that had a tendency to lunge. The one nearest Harry tried twice and both times it pulled back like it had thought better of it. Harry hadn't done anything, hadn't said anything, hadn't even looked at it directly. Neville, next to him, had watched this with wide eyes. "How'd you do that?" "No idea," Harry said honestly. In defense against the dark arts, which was a class Harry was already finding nearly unbearable given that Professor Quirrell's lessons seemed primarily designed to make everyone frightened of things that weren't frightening if you just dealt with them, he sat at the back and felt something at the edge of his attention, a wrongness, like a smell that didn't belong. He kept looking at the back of Quirrell's turbaned head and then looking away. He didn't know what he was noticing, but he noticed it consistently enough that he filed it away somewhere at the back of his mind. He ran into Hermione in the corridor after lunch. She had clearly heard something. The school was not large and news moved through it at the speed of students who eavesdropped, which was all of them. She fell into step beside him with the air of someone who had been waiting for a reasonable opening. "People are saying the ICW is here," she said. That's connected to your diagnostic, isn't it? With Professor Flitwick. Harry glanced at her sideways. He'd known her less than 2 months but he'd already developed a solid understanding of her. She used declarative sentences instead of questions when she was certain, and questions only when she was actually unsure. She was certain right now. "It is," he said. "Are you all right?" Something about the directness of it, she'd gone past all the politics of the situation and straight to that, made him look at her for a moment. "I think so," he said. "I'm still figuring out what the new normal feels like. New normal because of what they found, or new normal because of what they're doing about it. Both." She walked beside him quietly for a moment, which for Hermione was approximately 4 seconds. 31, she said then. Harry didn't ask how she knew. "Yeah. Harry, that's not an accident. That's a project. He looked at her again. She was staring straight ahead, jaw set, working through the logical implications with the same intensity she brought to everything else. He'd noticed she was more useful than almost anyone he'd met so far precisely because she didn't flinch from conclusions. I know, he said. Do you know who? Some of them, he said. She processed this for exactly 3 steps of corridor. And you're not, she paused, seeming to decide on a word, spiraling. No. Why not? Harry thought about this. Because they're fixing it, he said. And because I'm not going to waste the time I have being angry about time I already lost. Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression, not quite calculation and not quite respect, something that sat between them. That's very pragmatic of you, she said. I have my moments. They parted at the staircase, and Harry went back to Gryffindor Tower and sat in the window seat and put his hand flat against the stone of the wall and felt the whole castle hum back at him like a string struck in a resonating chamber, and sat very quietly thinking about what it meant that he'd never felt this before. That this had always been there, beneath 31 deliberate doors all locked from the outside. He thought about the signatures Ionescu had mentioned. Dumbledore's. The unknown ones. And the one that made Ionescu's voice go flat and careful. Voldemort. Someone who was supposedly dead had managed to put a binding on his core. Which meant someone who was supposedly dead was involved in his life in a more ongoing way than anyone seemed to want to discuss. He filed that one away too. He was building quite a file. At 10:30 that night, when the common room had mostly emptied and the fire had dropped to a low amber, Ron found him still at the window seat with a charms textbook open in his lap that he hadn't been reading. Heard some of it, Ron said, dropping into the chair closest to him. He didn't try to pretend he hadn't. Fred and George know someone in the Ravenclaw prefects who overheard the deputy headmistress talking to someone in the corridor. Chinese whispers all the way down, Harry said. Pretty much. Ron scratched the back of his neck. Are you actually all right? Not the version of all right you told Hermione. Harry looked at him. Ron had the characteristic directness of someone who had 5 older brothers. He'd run out of patience for indirect conversation around age 6. Harry found it consistently useful. Something's been done to me, Harry said. A lot of somethings. And some of the people who did them are people I was just supposed to trust automatically, because they're authority figures, because they're famous, because they're good. He looked out the window at the dark grounds. And I'm sitting here thinking about how many other things I've just taken on trust. Without looking. That's not a bad thing, Ron said after a moment. Looking, I mean. That's a pretty good response, actually. I'm 11. Yeah. Ron paused. But you called it, Hermione said it and you didn't contradict her, you called what happened to you a project. Like something organized. That's not 11, that's, I don't know what that is. It's what it is, Harry said. I didn't choose it. Ron was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. What happens tomorrow? More removals. Then at some point, someone from the ministry comes. Harry turned the quill over in his fingers, he'd kept it, the one he'd called across the room without trying. And then I imagine it gets complicated. More complicated than already complicated? Yeah. Harry put the quill down. Because right now it's just an investigation. Once the ministry is involved, it becomes politics. He paused. And I'd quite like to be mostly unbound before that part. Ron stared at him. How do you know that? Harry shrugged once. I don't know. I just know that if I go into a political fight with 21 more bindings on, I'm going to lose in a way that I won't if I go in without them. Ron looked at him for a long moment. Harry, he said slowly. Yeah. You're terrifying. Harry picked up the quill again and finally cracked open the charms textbook to where he'd actually meant to be reading. Not yet, he said mildly. They sat by the dying fire until nearly midnight, not talking much, which was exactly what Harry needed, someone nearby who wasn't trying to manage him, who had nothing to gain, who just stayed. In his office 3 floors down, Phileas Flitwick sat at his desk with a cup of tea that had gone cold and the ICW injunction document on the table in front of him, reading it for the 4th time with the particular feeling of a man who has done something irreversible and knows, clearly and without regret, that he'd do it again. Outside the window, the lake was dark and still, and somewhere above the clouds the owl he'd sent 2 nights ago was probably sleeping off its journey, tucked into some Jean Van postal roost with no idea that the letter it had carried was already reshaping something that had been in place for a decade. Flitwick folded the document. Locked it in his safe. Drank his cold tea. He'd run the diagnostic a 4th time, in private, after the ICW arrived. Just to be certain. Still 31. All still there. 21 still to go. He thought about the boy, that quiet, precise who did this instead of fear, the quill moving across the room without effort, the absolute absence of panic in eyes that had every right to it, and he felt, alongside the justified apprehension of what was coming, something that was straightforwardly the opposite of regret. He'd made the right call. He was nearly certain the next few weeks were going to be extremely difficult, and he was entirely certain it didn't matter. The letter had been sent. The people were here. The bindings were coming off. Everything else was just what happened next. Chapter 2, The Unbinding. The second session was scheduled for Thursday morning, 6 o'clock, before the castle properly woke up. Harry was already awake when the time came. He'd slept in short intervals, surfacing every hour or so not from nightmares but from something more like restlessness, his magic moving differently under his skin, testing edges that weren't there anymore, finding new room and not quite knowing what to do with it. It wasn't unpleasant. It was the feeling of a muscle that had been clenched for so long that the relaxation itself felt strange. He dressed in the dark without lighting a lamp, left Ron snoring with his arm thrown over his face, and went down the stairs into the empty common room where the fire had rebuilt itself overnight into low orange coals. He stood in front of it for a moment, put his hand out, palm toward the flames, and felt the heat the same way he'd felt the castle humming through the stone, layered, complex, more information than he'd ever had access to before. He could feel the fire wanting to grow. A week ago he would have called that his imagination. He went to Flitwick's classroom. Dar. Vas was already there, instruments laid out on a conjure table, speaking quietly in Hungarian to herself or possibly to her equipment, Harry wasn't certain which. Ionescu stood by the window with a cup of something hot and a look on his face of someone who had been awake for some time. Flitwick was perched on his stool with a second cup of tea he offered to Harry without comment. Harry took it. It was very sweet. He decided not to mention this and drank it anyway. The second group is more complex than the first, Dr. Vass said, pulling on her thin diagnostic gloves with the snapping efficiency of someone who'd done it several thousand times. The first 10 were output suppressors, they reduced what your magic could do at the surface level. This group goes deeper. These are structural bindings. They sit on the parts of your core that govern instinct, perception, ambient magical sensitivity. She looked at him steadily. What you've been noticing since yesterday, the heightened perception, picking up objects without intent, that will increase significantly after this group. How significantly? I genuinely don't know, she said, which he appreciated more than if she'd reassured him. Your core is not a standard architecture, Mr. Potter. The structural depth of it is unusual for your age. For any age, frankly. What does that mean? It means that whoever built these bindings knew exactly what they were suppressing. She said it flatly, without drama, the way you might observe that it was raining. They didn't do it clumsily. They did it carefully, over years, targeting specific functional regions of your core with precise knowledge of what you would have become without them. She paused. These were not placed by someone guessing. These were placed by someone who had already taken a very good look. The room was quiet except for the instruments. Right, Harry said. Let's take them off, then. The second removal took longer than the first. Dr. Vass worked with greater care this time, explaining in short phrases what she was doing, not because Harry had asked but because it was clearly her practice, the way a surgeon might narrate to a student, or to themselves. This one sits over your ambient perception. This one is layered over your instinctive threat assessment. Yes, you have that, most people don't, it's been completely dormant. She pulled a binding that had been placed when Harry was approximately 3 years old, and he felt something open behind his eyes that he had no vocabulary for, a kind of depth of field that extended past what he could see and into what the air around him was doing. "Breathe," she said. He breathed. "The disorientation will settle in about 20 minutes. Your brain is receiving inputs it has never processed before. Give it time to learn the map." "Is that what it is?" he said, because the room felt like it was made of information and some of it was pressing. "Yes." She moved to the next one. "Focus on something specific. One object, one temperature, one sound. It anchors the adjustment." He focused on the cup of tea Flitwick had given him, still warm in his hand, and let the rest of the new input wash past rather than fighting it. After a few minutes it settled into something manageable, still more than before, but organized, sortable. He was aware of Flitwick watching him from across the room. He was aware of something in the corridor outside, a large animal, he thought, or possibly a person who moved like one. Castle ghost, maybe. The ambient trace of it was unfamiliar. He was also, distantly and with increasing clarity, aware of something in the upper levels of the castle that felt like static on a radio, a wrongness with a specific direction, above and to the north. He filed it under Quirrell and kept breathing. Dar. Vass removed the 11th binding and then the 12th, and on the 13th she paused. "This one," she said carefully, "is not the same construction as the others." Ionescu, who had been standing by the window the entire time, set down his cup. "The signature," Dr. Vass continued, speaking in a lower register now, her voice professionally flattened, "is partially consistent with the structure of a soul anchor binding. Very old magic. Very dark." She looked at Harry. "Mr. Potter. I need to ask, have you ever had any sensation of a foreign presence in your mind?" Harry thought about the dreams he had occasionally, green light and a high cold laugh, and the way they felt less like memories and more like being shown something. "Sometimes," he said. "And your scar? Pain, beyond just physical?" He thought about the first time he'd looked at Quirrell, and how the wrongness he'd noticed today had been present then too in embryonic form, a specific kind of headache, sharp and directional. "Yes." Ionescu crossed the room in 4 steps. He looked at the binding diagnostic image Dr. Vass had projected above Harry's head, a kind of luminous map of his core, each binding highlighted in a different color, the 13th one a deep, unpleasant red-black that didn't sit cleanly within the others. "This is not something I removed today," Dr. Vass said. "This requires specialist consultation." Specifically, she glanced at Ionescu. "Flamel," he said. "Yes." Harry looked between them. "Who's Flamel?" Flitwick made a small sound from his stool that might have been many things. "Nicholas Flamel," Ionescu said, "is the only living wizard with sufficient experience in soul magic to advise on this safely. He is 665 years old and he does not take requests easily, but I believe when I contact him with this particular diagnostic map, he will make an exception." His tone suggested he had some basis for this belief. "We skipped 13. We continue." "There's a piece of someone else's soul anchored to me," Harry said. "Potentially, yes." Harry sat with this for a moment. Around him the morning light was coming through Flitwick's high windows, catching dust motes, making the room warm. Somewhere far above, a student was walking a corridor. He could track it, the footsteps registering in his expanded perception as a pattern moving through stone. "Remove the rest of them," he said. Dr. Vass continued. By the time the second session was done, 14 removed out of the remaining 21, with the 13th set aside, Harry walked out of Flitwick's classroom into a Hogwarts that felt entirely different from the one he'd walked into 6 weeks ago. The castle was alive. He'd always known this intellectually. Everyone said Hogwarts was magical in ways that went beyond spellwork, that it was sentient in some loose, ambient sense. He understood now that this was an understatement. The building had a presence, a distributed awareness that ran through the stone and mortar and ancient wood like blood through a body. He could feel it the way you could feel sunlight on your skin, not as thought, not as communication, but as something that knew he was there and registered his presence with a kind of slow, old attention. He pressed his hand to a wall on his way to breakfast. The stone was warm under his palm. The castle said nothing in words. But something in the texture of the warmth changed slightly. A recognition. "All right," he said, quietly, to no one visible. "Me too." He went to breakfast. The great hall was filling up with the early risers. Hermione was already at the Gryffindor table with a book propped against the juice pitcher. Percy Weasley was marking something with focused authority at the other end. A group of Ravenclaws were arguing about last night's astronomy homework. Harry sat down across from Hermione and started loading his plate, and she looked at him over the top of her book and lowered it slightly. "You look different," she said. "Do I?" "Your eyes are doing something." He poured himself pumpkin juice. "What kind of something?" She looked at him steadily. Hermione never looked away from things she was trying to catalogue. "Like you're looking at more things at once than you were yesterday." "That's accurate." They removed more. "Most of them." He ate a piece of toast. "There are 7 left. One of them is complicated, so they're leaving it for a specialist. 6 more to go after that." She set her book down entirely now, which for Hermione was a significant gesture. "How do you feel?" He thought about it honestly. "Like I've had ears my whole life, but someone's been playing the world at half volume," he said. "And now they've turned it up, and I'm adjusting." She was quiet for a moment. "Is it overwhelming?" "A bit. It's manageable. The things you can do now, the wandless magic, don't mention that too loudly," he said, without any particular urgency. She dropped her voice automatically. "The wandless magic. Is that because of the bindings coming off, or was that always there and just, both, I think?" He looked down at his hand, turned it over on the table. "I think I've been doing things with magic my whole life without a wand that I thought were accidents. Or abnormalities. Or things to be frightened of." He picked up his fork. "They weren't." Hermione watched him for a moment with that look she got when she was recalibrating something fundamental. "Harry," she said carefully. Are you frightened at all? About what you can do?" "About what?" She seemed to be choosing words. "About what you are." He looked at her. "No," he said. And then, because it was true and she deserved accurate information, "I think other people are going to be, though." She picked up her book, but he could tell she wasn't reading. She was thinking about it, the way she thought about everything, with a kind of relentless momentum that would eventually arrive at a conclusion whether she wanted it to or not. Ron appeared at 7:30, dropped into the seat next to Harry, and immediately began serving himself enough food for 3 people. He looked between Harry and Hermione and registered the atmosphere. "Already happened," he said to Harry. "Already happened. And I can feel you were anxious coming down the corridor." Ron paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "You can, ambient emotional register." "Apparently." Harry kept his face neutral. "Yours is loud." "It's fine, very useful actually, I like knowing what people are actually." "Absolutely not," Ron said. "That's deeply unfair. I genuinely cannot turn it off yet." "Unfair." Hermione made a sound that, for Hermione, was the closest approximation of a laugh she'd managed in Harry's presence so far. It was brief and quickly suppressed, but it was there. Professor Dumbledore appeared at the Gryffindor table at 7:55, moving along it with the unhurried grace of someone who owned the room in every meaningful sense. He had a plate of toast in one hand and his other hand rested on the back of various chairs as he passed, a greeting here, a gentle inquiry there. He had the gift of making each person he spoke to feel like the most noticed person in the room, and Harry had spent 5 weeks finding this enormously reassuring. He found it significantly less reassuring now. He could feel Dumbledore coming before he saw him, not the specific ambient emotional register thing he'd noticed with Ron, but something structural, the ambient magical presence of a very powerful wizard moving through a space. Dense, layered, old. Controlled in the way that only truly powerful things needed to work to appear controlled. He kept eating his breakfast. "Harry," Dumbledore said pleasantly, stopping behind his left shoulder. "I wonder if you might spare me a few minutes today. My office, perhaps, after your morning lessons. I believe we have some things worth discussing." Harry turned around on the bench to look at him. Dumbledore's expression was everything it always was, warm, slightly twinkling, the face of the world's most trustworthy grandfather. His magical presence, which Harry could now feel with the same directness that he could feel the heat from a fire, was deeply, carefully, deliberately contained. Someone who spent a lot of effort making themselves feel smaller than they were. "I don't think that's possible today, Professor," Harry said. "I've got sessions scheduled." "Ah." A small pause. "The ICW process." "Yes, of course." The warmth didn't waver. "Perhaps we might find another time, then." "I do want you to know, Harry, that my door is always." "I know," Harry said. "Thank you, Professor." He turned back to his breakfast. He was aware of Dumbledore standing behind him for a moment, just a moment, 2 seconds at most, before moving on down the table. That pause, brief as it was, meant something. He'd expected more pushback. He'd expected the warm gentle insistent pressure that he'd only just started to recognize as a pattern. The pause meant Dumbledore was recalibrating too. Good. He needed to be doing that. Hermione, across the table, had her eyes on her book but she was watching him over the top of it. He gave her a fractional nod. She went back to reading. Amelia Bones arrived at 11 o'clock on Thursday morning, which was, as Flitwick had predicted, herself. She came through the flue in Dumbledore's office, the traditional route for ministry officials visiting Hogwarts, but she'd brought 2 hit wizards and her own personal legal liaison, a sharp-faced woman named Dawlish who was not related to the hit wizard of the same name and was apparently tired of being asked about it. Flitwick knew this because he encountered them in the corridor outside the headmaster's office while they were waiting for Dumbledore to finish a meeting, and Dawlish had explained the Dawlish situation to him unprompted with the weary specificity of someone who'd explained it many times. Amelia Bones was a solid woman in late middle age with a monocle she wore with the ease of someone who'd stopped thinking about it 20 years ago, short gray hair, and the kind of handshake that communicated exactly how many people she'd arrested personally. She'd been head of magical law enforcement for 6 years and she'd spent those 6 years being one of the very few senior ministry officials who consistently refused to let the department become either Dumbledore's instrument or Fudge's political theater. She shook Flitwick's hand in the corridor with the directness of someone who didn't do small talk under time pressure. "Phileas. I read Ionescu's preliminary filing." She said it quietly and moved on immediately. "I need to see the boy. He has charms in 20 minutes, Flitwick said. "My class, as it happens. After. I'll arrange it. I also need to know," she paused, checked that the corridor was empty, and lowered her voice another register. "Was any of this voluntary on the boy's part? Any of the bindings? Does he have any prior knowledge of the process, any reason to believe he consented in some form that, he was an infant when most of them were placed?" Flitwick said. "He was 11 when he found out they existed. He had been at Hogwarts for approximately 6 weeks. Amelia closed her eyes for approximately half a second, which for Amelia Bones was the equivalent of a long, silent scream. Then she opened them and her expression was exactly as it had been. "After charms," she said. "Yes." Harry got through charms with the quiet efficiency of someone who decided to treat the class as normal because it was, in fact, still charms class regardless of what else was happening. He levitated things. He corrected his wrist movement when Flitwick suggested it, though both of them were aware that the wrist movement correction was, for Harry, currently somewhat academic. He was polite. He answered questions. He did not accidentally levitate anything he didn't mean to. Ron kept glancing at him from 2 seats over with the expression of someone waiting for something dramatic to happen. Nothing dramatic happened. The feathers floated. The class ended. Harry waited while the others filed out, Hermione gathering her bag with slightly more deliberation than necessary. She was trying to stay and he shook his head slightly and she pressed her lips together and left. When the room had cleared, Amelia Bones came in from the side door that connected to Flitwick's office, the door Harry hadn't noticed until she came through it, and that alone told him something about how she operated. She looked at him with the monocle and without preamble said, "I'm Amelia Bones. I run magical law enforcement at the Ministry. I'm here because what was done to you is illegal under at least a dozen statutes, and I intend to pursue appropriate action." She sat down across from him with the ease of someone who'd conducted 10,000 difficult conversations. "I also want to tell you clearly, before we start, I'm not here to manage you. I'm not here to make this easier for anyone except you. Are we understood?" Harry looked at her. He hadn't met many adults who started conversations by defining what they weren't doing. "Yes," he said. "Good." She opened a folder. "Tell me about the diagnostic. What Flitwick told you, how you responded, what happened since. Your words, your pace, don't skip anything you think I should know." He told her. It took about 15 minutes. She listened without interrupting, except twice, once to clarify a date, once to ask which session had revealed the soul anchor possibility, and when he said the 13th binding she wrote something down with a focused intensity that suggested 13th binding was a significant data point in a larger picture she was working from. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The soul anchor theory," she said. "Ionescu mentioned Flamel. Do you know who Nicholas Flamel is?" Flitwick made a sound when his name came up. "I inferred he was famous." Something in her expression shifted. He made a sound. A small one. Like someone's trying not to say something obvious. She looked at him steadily. "You're 11. People keep pointing that out. I'm going to stop doing that," she said. "It's not serving either of us." She closed the folder. Nicholas Flamel is the creator of the Philosopher's Stone. He is also one of 7 people in recorded wizarding history who has achieved a genuine understanding of soul magic, not the crude fragmentary approaches that practitioners of the dark arts have historically used, but a real theoretical comprehension of how magical souls work, how they can be divided, attached, manipulated. She paused. "The binding they found on you is sophisticated beyond anything that should be possible with modern knowledge. Which means whoever placed it had access to very old, very rare scholarship." Harry thought about Quirrell's classroom. The directional wrongness. "Or access to someone who did," he said. Amelia looked at him. "Voldemort," Harry said. "He had 11 years to study whatever he wanted, theoretically. Or however long dark wizards spend, studying things before they try to do them." He paused. "I keep feeling something in the North Tower. I think it's connected." The air in the room changed. Amelia's hand stilled on the folder. She didn't do the flinch at the name thing either, Harry noticed. She was watching him with the specific quality of attention of someone receiving information that slotted into a pre-existing, deeply serious picture. "The North Tower," she said carefully. "Not in the tower itself. Higher than that. The 3rd floor, north side." He paused. "There's something guarded up there. And the thing guarding it, or possibly inhabiting the space near it, overlaps with the wrongness I've been feeling since I sat in Quirrell's first class." He met her eyes. "He has a soul problem too, doesn't he?" Amelia sat back in her chair. She looked at him for a long time, not the patronizing or sentimental kind of looking at the child, but the concentrated reassessment of someone encountering a variable they hadn't fully accounted for. "I think," she said slowly, "that I need to make some urgent inquiries that have nothing to do with the bindings and everything to do with what you just told me." She stood. "Are you safe in this school?" "From most things, yes," Harry said. "From the thing in the north side corridors, I don't know yet. But I'm not worried." "Why not worried?" He thought about the castle's warmth under his palm that morning. The old attentive recognition. "The castle knows I'm here," he said. "The real me. Not the suppressed version." He paused. "I don't think it's going to let anything happen to me." Amelia Bones had been a working witch for 35 years and had heard a lot of claims about magical protection, and she had developed a calibrated sense for which ones were fantasy and which ones were grounded in real magical comprehension. She looked at Harry Potter sitting across from her in a charms classroom and she made a judgment call. She believed him. "I'll be in the castle for at least 2 days," she said. "My room is on the 2nd floor, guest wing. If anything changes, if anything feels more wrong, you come to me or you come to Ionescu. You don't report to Dumbledore, you don't go to McGonagall without checking with me first. Is that clear?" "Crystal," Harry said. She left. Harry sat in the empty charms classroom for a moment, feeling the castle's ambient presence like background music, and then he gathered his bag and went to Transfiguration. McGonagall noticed. She was too good not to. She'd been teaching for decades, she had a naturalist's eye for behavioral deviation from baseline, and Harry Potter's baseline had shifted measurably overnight. She didn't say anything during class. Her class was not a place for personal inquiries, it was a place for transfiguration, but afterward, when the others filed out, she said, "Potter," in that clipped way that meant stay. He stayed. She looked at him across the empty classroom with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. It was not the sharp but fair authority face she wore in class. It was something less protected, a face dealing privately with something that had arrived without warning and was still settling. "I've been informed," she said, in broad terms, "of what Professor Flitwick found." Harry waited. She stopped. Started again. "I want you to know, Potter, that had I known any of it, I would have," and again she stopped, and he watched her jaw tighten with the effort of navigating something that didn't have clean sentences available for it. "I know," he said. "You can't know that." "I think I can," he said. "Not cruelly. Just directly. You're not good at not doing the right thing, Professor. I think it's probably physically uncomfortable for you." Something moved across her face that was complicated and brief. "That is," she started. "I'm not angry at you," Harry said. "I'm not angry at anyone here who didn't know." He picked up his bag. "The things I feel about the people who did know are mine to work through. But not with you." She stood very still, this woman who'd been at Hogwarts for 40 years, who'd known Dumbledore that entire time, whose entire professional world was in the process of being reorganized around a diagnostic scroll and 11 minutes of results, and she looked at Harry Potter, who should by all rights be frightened or overwhelmed or at least young, and who was instead looking at her with a steady directness that required nothing from her, asked for nothing, offered something without naming it. And she said, very quietly, "If you need anything, Mr. Potter. Anything at all." "Thank you, Professor." He left. She sat down at her desk and looked at nothing in particular for quite a while. The last event of the day was the one that set the following week in motion. It happened at dinner, and it was not dramatic, it was precisely the opposite of dramatic, which made it worse. Dumbledore stood at the head table and made a brief announcement between the soup and the main course, the way he sometimes made small administrative notes, a reminder about curfew, a caution about the 3rd-floor corridor. His voice carried the warmth of long practice, the avuncular ease of a man comfortable with his own authority. "I also want to take a moment to welcome our visiting colleagues from the ICW, he said, with a smile at the faculty table where Ionescu was sitting with the complete stillness of someone who had expected this. Their work here reflects the exceptional care that all of us at Hogwarts extend to the well-being of our students. I have every confidence in their professionalism, and I know our community will extend them every courtesy." He sat back down and resumed eating. A murmur ran through the hall. Mostly curious, slightly apprehensive, the student body knowing something was happening and being now given the ambiguous cover story of ICW inspection. Nothing alarming. The headmaster endorsed it. It was fine. Harry ate his dinner. Ionescu, across the hall at the faculty table, had not changed his expression. But he met Harry's eyes for a moment, just a glance, brief and level, and then returned to his meal. The message in it was simple. He's already managing the narrative. Harry had already known that. What he found more interesting was that Dumbledore had done it openly, in public, giving the ICW team a legitimizing frame before they could build their own. Preemptive reputation management. It was a good move. It made Ionescu's investigation look like something Dumbledore was comfortable with, something he had authority adjacent to, something that by implication wasn't directed at him. It was a good move. Harry thought, "You have 4 bindings documented on my core and you stood up there and made yourself the welcoming host." He thought, "I need the remaining 6 off before any formal proceeding begins." He thought, "And I need to find out who the third party is. The 11 bindings that aren't yours and aren't Voldemort's. Because whoever that is, they're not in this room, and they're not in trouble yet, and that's the piece nobody seems to be talking about loudly enough." He ate his dinner and said nothing. Ron, beside him, was vibrating slightly with things he wanted to say that he was commendably restraining. Later, Harry said, "I know. The common room. I know, I'm not, I just, later, Ron." Ron ate his soup with aggressive patience. Hermione, across the table, caught Harry's eye. She had her thinking face on, the one that meant she'd been running threads all day and they were now converging toward something. She would tell him when she'd finished working it out. That was fine. He trusted her process. He trusted his. He trusted the castle, warm and old and attentive, present in the stone under his feet. He had 24 bindings removed and 7 to go, and one of those 7 was a piece of someone else's soul attached to his forehead, and that was extraordinary and would need to be dealt with, but right now he was eating dinner in a hall full of people and he was, for possibly the first time in his life, here, fully, completely, without the thick glass of suppression between him and the world. It felt like standing in weather. It felt like standing in weather and not flinching. He finished his dinner. He helped Ron with a section of his Transfiguration homework that Ron had been approaching from entirely the wrong direction. He laughed at something Fred Weasley said from further down the table that was genuinely funny. He watched Dumbledore have a quiet, apparently warm conversation with Ionescu over pudding, and he watched Ionescu respond with perfect professional courtesy and absolute zero warmth, and he thought about the distance between those two things and what it meant. It meant tomorrow would be interesting. It meant the next week would be the thing everything else built toward. It meant that 6 remaining bindings, 1 specialist, 1 third party still unidentified, and 1 piece of enemy soul anchored behind his scar were the equations left to solve, and that he was going to solve them on his terms, in his time, without anyone else's hand on the dial. He went to the common room. He talked to Ron and Hermione. He slept, this time, all the way through until morning. Chapter 3, The Weight of 31. Nicholas Flamel arrived on Friday evening in a way that suggested he had strong opinions about dramatic entrances, specifically, that they were for people who needed them. He came through the main gates on foot, alone, carrying a battered leather case and wearing traveling robes so worn they had passed through distinguished into something more like geological. He was not tall. He was not imposing. He looked, if anything, like someone's great-great-grandfather who had taken a very long walk and would like a cup of tea. His face was the face of extreme age done honestly, not magically preserved into false youth but genuinely, thoroughly old, every year of 6.5 centuries present and accounted for in the topography of it. Flitwick met him at the gates because Ionescu had asked him to, and because Flitwick was the one person on staff whose credentials Flamel was likely to respect on short acquaintance. They shook hands and Flamel looked at him with eyes that were the color of old amber and considerably younger than everything else about him. "You found 31, Flamel said, without preamble. "Yes." "Show me the diagnostic map." They walked. Harry didn't know Flamel had arrived until Saturday morning, when Flitwick sent the silver bird charm to the Gryffindor table at breakfast and it whispered 9 o'clock, "Bring nothing, just yourself." He went down to the classroom to find it more crowded than the previous sessions, Dr. Vass at her instruments, Ionescu at the window, Flitwick on his stool, Amelia Bones in a chair near the door, and a very old man sitting in the examination chair that was meant for Harry, examining the diagnostic map projection with the focused attention of someone reading an extremely interesting book. Flamel looked up when Harry walked in. He looked at Harry for a moment, a long, cataloging look that reminded Harry of the way Dr. Vass looked at her instruments, not unkind but thoroughly professional, and then he said, in accented English that carried traces of medieval French like sediment in water, "Sit down, please. I have some questions and then I will tell you what I found." Harry sat in the spare chair. "The 13th binding," Flamel said. "You have felt it your whole life as bad dreams and directional pain." "Yes. Yes. And since the other bindings began to be removed, the sensation has become clearer." "Sharper," Harry confirmed. "More specific. Like the difference between knowing something is wrong and knowing what is wrong." Flamel nodded once, slowly. "That is because the other bindings were also suppressing your awareness of it. They were, not intentionally shielding you from it, I think. I do not think that was their purpose. But the side effect of suppressing your perception was that you perceived this thing less clearly than you otherwise would have." He paused. "You understand what the 13th binding is? A soul fragment. Attached to my scar." "Yes." Flamel looked at him steadily. "Do you understand what that means?" "Tell me," Harry said, because he had his own theory but he wanted the 665-year-old expert's version before he compared notes. "When a wizard kills," Flamel said, with the directness of someone who had spent centuries having difficult conversations, "there is a rupture. The soul, which is not a metaphor, it is a real and measurable magical structure, is damaged by the act. Dark magic of sufficient intensity and specific intent can deliberately exploit this rupture to detach a fragment of the soul and anchor it to an object or a living vessel. The fragment cannot be destroyed easily. It sustains the wizard who created it, providing a tether to existence that persists even if the body is destroyed." He stopped. "This is what was done with your scar, Mr. Potter. Not intentionally, Voldemort did not plan to make you a vessel. The rebounded killing curse destroyed his body and in doing so the rupture in his soul, already extensively damaged, expelled a fragment that attached to the only living thing nearby." The room was very quiet. Harry worked through this with the methodical patience that was increasingly becoming his characteristic response to difficult information. "So he's been alive," he said, "in a way. This whole time. A fragment only. Not conscious in any continuous way. But persistent. Present. And it's been attached to me since I was a year old." "Yes. And the binding over it, the 13th one, that was placed by someone to contain it. Not to remove it." "To, what, exactly?" Flamel looked at him with something that might have been respect. "To keep it dormant. To prevent it from influencing you actively, while also preventing any casual diagnostic from clearly identifying it for what it was." He paused. "The construction of that binding is extraordinary. I have not seen its like. It required knowledge of soul fragment theory that has not been published since the 14th century. Whoever placed it had access to scholarship that is not available in any current library." He looked at Ionescu. "This is your third party. The same signature as the 11 unidentified bindings," Ionescu said. "Yes." Harry looked between them. Someone knew about the soul fragment. Before the ICW investigation. Before any of this, someone placed a binding on it decades ago and also placed 11 other bindings on me and nobody knows who. That is the current state of our knowledge, yes, Ionescu said. Harry sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. That's fascinating, he said. Several people in the room looked at him. I mean it, he said. Someone out there has 600-year-old scholarship on soul magic, knew about Voldemort's fragment, placed a specialized binding on it, and also bound 11 other aspects of my core. And they did all this quietly and have stayed quiet through the entire ICW investigation so far. He brought his gaze back down to level. That's either the most dangerous person in this story or the most interesting one. Possibly both, Flamel said. Can you remove the 13th binding? Yes, Flamel said, without hesitation. But not in the way Dr. Vass has removed the others. This is not a suppression binding. This is a containment structure, and when we remove it, the soul fragment will no longer be contained. He folded his hands in his lap. What we do then, with the fragment, that is the delicate part. A fragment cannot simply be expelled. It must be drawn out through a specific process, and the process requires preparation. How long? 2 days. I need to prepare the working space and several compound solutions that Dr. Vass does not carry. He looked at Harry directly. I want to be clear with you. The removal process will not be painless. The fragment has been anchored to that scar for 10 years. Separating it will hurt. How much? Flamel considered this with the honesty of someone who didn't see the point of comfortable lies. More than you would like. Harry nodded once. 2 days, then. What about the remaining 6 bindings in the meantime? Dr. Vass answered this one. We can remove 5 of them today. The 6th sits adjacent to the 13th and I want to leave it until after the fragment is dealt with, the proximity makes it unpredictable. Let's do the 5 now, Harry said. Then we'll have a full picture. The 5 remaining bindings came off in 90 minutes. The first 2 were straightforward, output refinement suppressors, the type that fine-tuned which kinds of magic expressed easily and which were dampened. Harry felt the removal of these as a kind of clarification, like an image being brought into sharper resolution. His affinity for charms had already been strong, he now understood that strong had been the suppressed version of something considerably more significant. The third was a memory binding. Dar. Vass explained this one in her careful, clinical shorthand. It had been placed to prevent recall of specific pre-Hogwarts experiences and some early childhood memories, specifically those in which Harry had demonstrated significant accidental magic. As she removed it, he sat very still and let the returning memories settle in where they belonged. He remembered being 4 years old, in the Dursleys' back garden, crying because Dudley had broken a toy he'd found in a skip and somehow cared about, and the toy reassembling itself in his hands. He remembered being 6 and very cold in his cupboard and the heating pipe suddenly becoming warm against his back. He remembered being 8 and a glass in the kitchen cupboard, which he'd been told to clean and which Aunt Petunia had then knocked off the counter deliberately, stopping 6 inches from the floor and floating there until he'd caught it. He remembered the expression on her face. He filed these without distress. They were just his. They had always been his and they were back now. The 4th binding was something Dr. Vass took her time with, frowning slightly as she worked, the diagnostic instruments flickering at the edges of their range. She explained after, it was a social suppression binding, placed specifically on his ability to project magical confidence, the natural aura that very powerful wizards carried, that made people instinctively recognize their magical weight without any deliberate action on the wizard's part. This is why, she said, you have not registered to others as, she paused, choosing words, as what you are. Most wizards of your actual core magnitude would be felt when they walked into a room by anyone with basic magical sensitivity. You have effectively been invisible in that sense. Harry thought about Dumbledore in the Great Hall that morning, his controlled, deliberately self-contained magical presence. Some people manage their projection consciously, he said. Yes. This binding removed the ability and the choice simultaneously. He felt the removal of it as something like stepping from indoors to outside, a sudden extension of himself into space that hadn't previously been available. He was aware of everyone in the room very precisely. Not intrusively, not reading their thoughts or their intentions, but present to them, and they to him, in a way that felt natural and grounded rather than like surveillance. Flitwick, on his stool, went very still. Harry glanced at him. "Professor?" Flitwick exhaled through his nose. "Yes. I see. I see what she means." He looked at Harry with the focused, slightly odd expression of a charms master encountering exceptional work. "Mr. Potter, you have been walking around this school for 6 weeks and nobody has," he stopped himself. Cleared his throat. "Carry on, Dr. Vass." Amelia Bones, near the door, had gone very straight in her chair. The 5th binding was the last of the standard set, and its removal was the strangest, not painful, not dramatic, but accompanied by a feeling Harry could only describe as more room. A spatial sense for magic itself, a deep geometric awareness of how magical fields moved and interacted and layered, the kind of comprehension that was usually the product of decades of study but for Harry appeared to simply be native capacity that had been locked in a box since infancy. He stood up when it was done. The room felt different. He felt different in it, present in it in a way that wasn't aggressive or threatening but was entirely, flatly undeniable. 6 people in the room and he was aware of each of them the way you were aware of furniture, not in a dismissive sense but in a thoroughly grounded spatial sense. He knew where Flitwick was without looking. He knew Amelia Bones had tensed when he stood up and then consciously relaxed. He could feel the castle very clearly. It was, if possible, even more attentive than before. He looked at his hands, which were just his hands, no visible change. Magic didn't tend to show. That was the thing people forgot about power, it was invisible until it moved. 25 down, he said. 6 to finish after Flamel's preparation. One of the 6 is adjacent to the soul fragment, to be done last. He looked at Ionescu. That leaves us 2 days. Ionescu nodded. During which I expect the formal tribunal notice from the ICW to arrive. Dumbledore will be required to respond to it. Once he does, the situation becomes, he paused. Public, Amelia finished. Yes. Harry looked between them. How public? The ICW doesn't do quiet, Amelia said, with something dry in her voice. When they move on something like this, the Wiesengemot gets informed, the Daily Prophet gets an official statement whether they want it to or not, and every ministry in Europe with a stake in British wizarding affairs starts paying attention. She paused. Albus Dumbledore is the supreme mugwump of the ICW. When the ICW investigates him, it becomes the most significant political event in the British wizarding world since the end of the last war. Does that change what you can do legally? No, she said. The evidence is the evidence. Political significance doesn't alter the statutes. A pause. It does, however, create pressure. There will be people in positions of authority who will want this to go away quietly. I am not one of those people. Ionescu is not one of those people. Flamel is 665 years old and does not care about British ministry politics at all. Another pause. But there are others. Harry nodded. He'd expected this. Then we use the 2 days. For what specifically? He looked at her. To get everything documented and sealed before the political pressure starts. Every binding, every signature, every date of placement. Flamel's testimony on the soul fragment. The full accounting. If it's all formally sealed before anyone can apply pressure, then pressure becomes irrelevant. Amelia studied him. That is exactly correct, she said, in a tone that was slightly different from the one she'd been using, something more level, more peer-to-peer. I'll have my liaison start the formal documentation process today. Good. Flamel, who had been watching Harry throughout the session with the patient interest of someone watching a natural phenomenon, said, "Come to the prepared room tomorrow evening, Mr. Potter. Bring no one. The working requires quiet." "All right," Harry said. "And eat well beforehand." Flamel picked up his leather case and headed for the door, pausing on the threshold. "In case you were wondering, yes. Of the 112 people I have examined in my work on soul magic, you are the youngest and the only one whose core structure genuinely surprises me." He said it like an observation, not a compliment. "That is unusual for me." He left. Harry stood in the charms classroom surrounded by investigators and one small professor who was looking at him with an expression combining professional admiration and something that might have been paternal worry, and thought, tomorrow night, then. Saturday afternoon was almost aggressively normal. Ron wanted to play Exploding Snap. Harry played Exploding Snap. 3 rounds, Ron won 2 of them because Harry was still calibrating the new layers of his perception and kept knowing which card was coming before it arrived, which made him hesitate in ways that worked against him. The 4th round he stopped hesitating and Ron looked at his face across the board and said, "You're doing the thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you know things." "I'm not cheating." "I know you're not cheating, I'm saying you know things and it's affecting your natural reactions." Ron reshuffled the deck. "Play like you don't know. Pretend you're guessing." Harry tried this. He won the 4th round easily. "I think I played better when I was suppressed," Ron said sadly. "You played better when I was suppressed," Harry agreed. "This is very unfair." "You said that already." "It's worth repeating." Hermione came and found them in the common room at around 4 in the afternoon, dropped into the chair across from Harry, and put a piece of parchment on the table between them. It was covered in her handwriting in 3 columns. Harry looked at it. "What is this?" "It's a list," she said. "Of every incident in your school career so far, 6 weeks, I know, bear with me, where your response to something, or your ability to do something, or someone's response to you, could have been different if the bindings hadn't been there." He picked it up. The list was longer than 6 weeks should have produced. She'd included the obvious things, his Quidditch performance in tryouts, where even at suppressed level he'd caught the quaffle 37 times in a row before would stop counting, his performance in charms, his apparently instinctive grasp of magical theory in class. She'd also included less obvious things, the incident in potions where he'd correctly intuited a missing step that Snape had deliberately omitted from the board, and Snape had looked at him with an expression that she'd been trying to categorize ever since. And at the bottom, in a slightly different ink, a section headed, "Things that might not be coincidences." "The troll," Harry said. "Yes," Hermione said. "On Halloween. The troll that ended up in the girls' bathroom on the same floor as me while you and Ron were finding out about it and coming to help." She held his gaze. "A troll doesn't just wander into a castle. It has to be let in. And the timing, you two arriving exactly when it was about to do serious damage, you think someone wanted to see what I'd do," Harry said. She pressed her lips together. "I think someone wanted to see what you'd do, yes. Under pressure. With a genuine threat." She paused. "And I think that someone may have been disappointed, because at suppressed level you performed, well, you stopped a troll. But the performance was limited." Ron was staring at her. "Hermione, you could have been killed." "I know that, Ron, that's rather the point." Harry set the parchment down. He thought about the troll. About Professor Quirrell, who had reportedly found it and then fainted. Quirrell, who Harry had known for 6 weeks carried a wrongness that was directional and specific. Quirrell, who had the static quality of something layered over something else. "It was a test," Harry said. "By Voldemort. Through Quirrell." "I think so," Hermione said. "And Dumbledore let it happen." "I don't know if he let it, he was there that night," Harry said. "He's always in this castle. He knows everything that moves in it. A mountain troll got through the front gates and he didn't stop it." He looked at her. That's not incompetence. That's a choice. The common room fire crackled. Outside the window the November afternoon was darkening fast, the grounds going grey-blue and cold. The third-floor corridor, Ron said suddenly. Both of them looked at him. He'd been quiet throughout Hermione's presentation in the way he was quiet when he was actually paying close attention. He told us explicitly on the first day. Don't go there or you'll die. Which is, who says that to 11-year-olds on their first day? You say this corridor is off limits, not you will literally die. That's an invitation. He was, funneling, Harry said. Ron blinked. What? Funneling. Creating a path. He wants me to go down that corridor. He wants me to encounter whatever's there. The warning isn't a deterrent, it's a pointer. He paused. Which means whatever's in that corridor is part of the larger architecture. Not just guarding something, it's a stage. Hermione had gone very still. A stage for what? For whatever I'm supposed to do, Harry said. Whatever the endgame of all this is. The prophecy Ionescu mentioned. Whatever Dumbledore thinks I'm being prepared for. The fire crackled again. He bound you, Hermione said quietly. For 11 years. And he built a stage for you here. At the same time. She shook her head slowly. He wants you capable enough to face whatever's at the end of the corridor, but not so capable that he can't control you going in. Yes, Harry said. That's exactly it. They sat with that for a moment. What's actually in the corridor? Ron asked. Do we know? The Philosopher's Stone, Harry said. Flamel's Stone. Which is now slightly more interesting given that Flamel is in this castle. Ron's expression went through several phases rapidly. So Flamel's stone is upstairs, Flamel is downstairs, there's a piece of Voldemort's soul attached to your forehead, the headmaster has been suppressing your magic since you were a baby, and we've been here 6 weeks. Yes, Harry said. Brilliant, Ron said. He sounded as though he meant it, which was one of the things Harry appreciated most about him. The formal documentation session happened Saturday evening in one of the unused classrooms on the second floor, which Ionescu had appropriated with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to using whatever space was necessary. Amelia's liaison Dawlish sat at one end of a long table with a self-writing quill and an expression of professional concentration, Ionescu sat at the other end, and Harry sat in the middle and went through every binding one at a time. Each one was documented, approximate date of placement, structural composition, effect on Harry's magical development, cross-reference to the signature of whoever had placed it. Dr. Vass provided the technical analysis for each one. Harry provided experiential testimony, what he had or hadn't been able to do, incidents in his childhood that now made new sense. Flitwick gave expert witness testimony on the charms assessment and his decision to contact the ICW. His testimony was recorded in full and sealed with 3 different magical notarization charms. Flamel gave a recorded statement on the soul fragment, its composition, his assessment of its origin, the specific old scholarship it reflected, and his professional testimony that the 13th binding had required knowledge unavailable in any current library. He spoke for 20 minutes in a measured, precise account that Dawlish's quill struggled to keep pace with, and at the end of it the sealed record contained the testimony of the only person alive with direct expertise in the relevant field. When they reached the 11 unidentified bindings, the room went quiet in a different way. We have the signature, Ionescu said, looking at the documentation. It is consistent across all 11. It is not in our database of known practitioners. It does not match any registered British or European magical signature on record. He paused. It does, however, have a structural quality that Flamel has identified as characteristic of a very specific school of pre-modern magical practice. He looked at Flamel. Flamel, who had been preparing to leave, paused at the door. It is old, he said. Older than the 4 Dumbledore bindings, older than most of what we have documented today. The earliest of the 11 was placed, I estimate, before Voldemort's first rise to power. Before the prophecy was made. He looked at Harry. Someone was interested in you before anyone else knew to be interested. The room absorbed this. That's impossible, Amelia said. The prophecy preceded. Prophecies are not self-contained, Flamel said, with the patience of someone correcting a fundamental error. They are recorded. They are heard. They can be sought. Someone with sufficient resources, sufficient foresight, sufficient access to prophetic knowledge could have identified a candidate before the official prophecy was made. He paused. The 11 bindings are not malicious in the way the others are. They are not output suppressors. They are not social dampeners. They are protective in intent, genuine protection, not the qualified protective reasoning that Dumbledore offered. He met Harry's eyes. Someone has been watching over you, Mr. Potter, in their way. Since before you were born. And they have been doing it very quietly. Protective, Harry said. Including the soul fragment containment. Yes. They knew about the fragment before I was born. Or they placed the fragment binding after the fact, within days of the event, I would estimate, given the freshness of the soul anchor at the time of the binding's placement. Flamel tilted his head. Either implies knowledge and access that is not easily explained. Harry thought about this. A third party. Protective intent. Ancient scholarship. Binding a soul fragment with medieval magic. Watching him since before his birth. Someone who loves him, Flitwick said suddenly, from the corner where he'd been sitting quietly for the last hour. Everyone looked at him. He looked slightly startled to have said it aloud, but he didn't retract it. The construction. I've been looking at the structural analysis all evening. The Dumbledore bindings are, regardless of his reasoning, they are control mechanisms. Efficient, cold, purpose-built. The unidentified 11 are, they're careful. They account for edge cases. They have redundancies built in to protect against the binding failing in harmful ways. That's not the work of a researcher or an agent. That is the work of someone who was frightened for him specifically. The room was very still. Someone who knew him before he was born, Amelia said slowly. Or who knew his parents, Ionescu said. Harry sat in the middle of the table and did not react outwardly, but something in his chest did something complicated and he let it, and then he filed it alongside everything else in the growing internal archive of things to work through when he had room for them. Tomorrow night, he said to Flamel, we remove 13 and get the fragment out. Flamel nodded. And then we find the third party, Harry said. Yes, said Flamel. I believe they may be findable now that we know what we're looking for. He paused, one hand on the doorframe. I also believe, Mr. Potter, that whoever they are going to be very relieved to know you are aware of them. He left. Harry stayed at the table while the others began packing up the documentation. Amelia's Dawlish stacked the sealed records with the care of someone handling irreplaceable objects, which they were. Ionescu reviewed the contents of each sealed package against his checklist. Dr. Vass cleaned and stored her instruments. Flitwick came and sat in the chair next to Harry. They sat quietly for a moment. I keep thinking about the troll, Harry said. In what sense? In the sense that Dumbledore let it in, or didn't stop it, because he wanted to see what I'd do. Harry looked at the table surface. Which means he's been watching me perform under pressure from the start. Every test, every challenge, everything in this school that's been positioned as dangerous or difficult, it's data. He's been gathering data. Flitwick was quiet. He's been building a case, Harry said. Not against me. For me. For a specific use of me. He needs to know exactly what I can do, exactly how I perform, exactly what my limits are, all while making sure those limits stay where he sets them. Harry looked up. He's not malicious in the way a dark wizard is malicious. He's malicious in the way an engineer is malicious. Flitwick looked at him for a long moment. You're describing someone who genuinely believes what he's doing is right, he said carefully. Yes, Harry said. Which is exactly why Ionescu said the defense was the most sophisticated thing he'd ever heard. Because it's not entirely wrong. Voldemort exists. The prophecy exists. The danger is real. He paused. He's just decided that I don't get to be a person while all that's going on. I get to be a tool that looks like a person. Flitwick reached over and picked up the empty tea mug that had been sitting in front of Harry since the start of the session. He turned it over in his small hands. I sent that letter, he said, because when I looked at those results I thought about what kind of person I wanted to be in this specific moment. Not what the rules required, not what was safest for my career, not what was most politically manageable. He set the mug down. I want you to know that I would do it again tomorrow. I know, Harry said. I also want you to know, Flitwick paused, and his voice shifted register slightly, losing the professional charms professor quality and becoming something more simply direct. Whatever happens in that room tomorrow night with Flammel. Whatever the fragment removal is like. You are going to be all right afterward. I'm very certain of that. Harry looked at him. Your core, Flitwick said simply. I've seen the diagnostic map. I've seen what's in there, underneath 31 layers of suppression and one piece of foreign soul. Whatever pain is involved in getting there, he stopped, and the rest of the sentence didn't need finishing. Harry nodded once. Thank you, he said, and meant it across several different dimensions at once. Sunday passed in the strange suspended quality of a day before something significant. Harry attended the optional Sunday morning session in the library that Hermione had organized under the guise of studying, which was actually Hermione presenting her research on soul fragment theory with the focused intensity of someone who had spent the previous night reading everything available, which for Hermione was thorough. Horcrux, she said, putting a book open on the table. The word sat in the air badly. I know, Harry said. Flammel told you. Implied it. There may be more than one, she said. If he fragmented his soul to attach one to you accidentally, it implies the soul was already fragmented. Deliberately. Which means there are objects out there, or potentially people, containing other pieces of him. Ron looked at the book with the expression of someone who would very much like to close it. This is a lot for a Sunday. It's relevant, Hermione said firmly. I know it's relevant, Ron looked at Harry. How are you not more bothered by this? There's a piece of the darkest wizard in living memory attached to your, Ron, Harry said mildly. I'm just saying, I know what you're saying. Harry sat back in his chair. I've had it for 10 years. One more day doesn't change 10 years. And tomorrow night it won't be there anymore. He turned a page in the book, looked at the diagram of a fragmented soul structure, looked at it with the new spatial comprehension that the removed bindings had given him. The diagram made sense in a way he suspected it wouldn't have yesterday. The geometry of it was clear to him now. What I want to know is whether removing one fragment destabilizes the others. Hermione blinked. Then reached for another book. Actually I don't know. I'll find out. When you do, write it down and send it to Flammel. She paused. You want me to send research to Nicholas Flammel? You've already found something he probably hasn't thought about in this specific context. He'd want to know. She stared at him. He's just very old, Harry said. He's not going to bite you. She wrote the question down in her notebook with very deliberate handwriting and then kept reading with the slightly elevated color of someone who had just been given an extremely exciting assignment. Ron kicked Harry under the table. Harry glanced at him. Ron jerked his head at Hermione and mouthed nice one. Harry went back to his book. He spent the afternoon outside, walking the grounds alone in the cold, hands in his pockets. The lake was iron-gray and still. Something vast moved under its surface, he could feel it, a huge old magical presence, curious and slow. He stood at the edge of the water for a while, feeling the castle behind him and the lake before him and the whole grounds as a kind of landscape of magical presence, each element of it distinct. He thought about his parents. He thought about someone placing 11 careful, loving bindings on a child they were frightened for, with 6th century scholarship and redundant safety mechanisms, before he was born. Someone who had known what was coming and had done everything they could within the limits of what was possible. He didn't know who it was yet. He thought he might cry about it when he found out. He didn't cry now, standing at the edge of the lake. He just stood there in the cold until the light started to go, and then he walked back toward the castle, and somewhere between the shore and the doors the castle's awareness met him, warm, old, enormous, and wholly without agenda, and he thought yes, I know at it, and walked inside. At 9 o'clock that evening he ate an actual meal as Flamel had instructed, a proper dinner, not picked at but consumed with the purposeful attention of someone fueling up for something, and then at 10 o'clock he went to the room Flamel had prepared on the 3rd floor, east side, well away from the north corridor and its guarded wrongness. He knocked. Flamel opened the door. The room behind him smelled of copper and something older, a mineral quality like stone that had been underwater, and the diagnostic instruments were different from Dr. Vasa's set, older and more complex, some of them clearly handmade. "Come in," Flamel said. "Sit. And remember that pain is information, not danger. When it comes, breathe through it and do not fight the process." Harry went in. Sat down. "Are you frightened?" Flamel asked. Harry considered this honestly. "No," he said. Flamel looked at him for a moment. Then something moved in the old amber eyes that might have been its own kind of grief, or its own kind of gladness, difficult to distinguish when a face had held enough years to blur the line between the two. "Good," he said. "Then we begin." Chapter 4, The Reckoning. The fragment came out at midnight. Harry didn't remember all of it cleanly afterward, not because he lost consciousness, but because the experience was the kind that the brain filed in a different location than ordinary memory, less a sequence of events and more a collection of impressions arranged around a central intensity. He remembered the cold that came first, spreading outward from his scar in concentric rings like dropping a stone in still water. He remembered Flamel's voice, steady and low, speaking in Latin and something older that wasn't any language Harry knew but registered in his body as meaning anyway. He remembered the pain. Flamel had said more than you would like and had been accurate in the way that calling an avalanche a lot of snow was accurate. It came in waves, each one originating at the scar and moving through his skull in a direction that wasn't quite physical, not the blunt impact of a headache but something more structural, as though something was being unwound that had been coiled into the architecture of him for a decade. He breathed. He did not fight it. The thing that came out, the fragment, he didn't see it directly, and later he thought that was probably deliberate on Flamel's part. He heard the instruments react, felt the room's ambient magic spike and then collapse inward like a fire using up its last fuel, and then there was a sound that was not quite a sound, more a resonance that passed through the walls and floor and his own ribs, and then it was over. The silence afterward was the cleanest thing he'd ever experienced. He sat in the chair with his hands on his knees and breathed, and the absence where the fragment had been was so profound that it had its own texture, not empty, not hollow, just clear. Like the difference between looking through glass and looking through air. Flamel was doing something with a sealed container at the far end of the room, his back to Harry, his movements careful and unhurried. He spoke without turning around. "How do you feel?" "Like myself," Harry said. Flamel stopped. Paused. "Yes," he said, quietly. "That is the correct answer." He turned around and looked at Harry with the full weight of 6.5 centuries of experience, and whatever he saw in Harry's face made him sit down in the chair across from him and set his hands flat on his knees, a kind of deliberate stillness, like someone witnessing something they want to give proper space to. "The fragment is contained," he said. "Permanently. I will take it with me when I leave." He paused. "It will not regenerate. The tether is gone. All of it. All of it that was in you." He held Harry's gaze steadily. "There may be others elsewhere. In objects. Possibly other vessels. The soul structure we analyzed before the removal suggested extensive prior fragmentation, more than 2, possibly more than 3 other fragments in existence. Hermione had that thought, Harry said. She sent me a note yesterday evening, Flamel said, with the closest thing to warmth he'd shown in Harry's presence. She is very precise. I wrote back. He paused. She asked 7 consecutive questions and then apologized for the number. I told her that people who apologize for asking questions have been taught to do so by people who preferred they remain ignorant. She'll like that. The question about destabilization is a good one. The answer is no, removing one fragment does not destabilize the others, because the fragmentation is not a unified structure. Each piece is independent. The soul that created them is already so damaged that the pieces have no meaningful connection to each other. He paused. They will need to be found and destroyed, eventually. But that is a separate problem from the one we solved tonight. One problem at a time, Harry said. Yes. Harry sat for a moment in the clean quiet of the room, feeling the castle through the floor, attentive, settled, that slow enormous awareness that recognized him now as fully present in a way it apparently had not before. He felt 25 bindings removed and his scar clear for the first time in his life, and the 6th remaining binding that Dr. Vass had left adjacent to the soul fragment site was still there, but it was the last thing, the final door, and they would open it in the morning. The third party, Harry said. Flamel looked at him. You said they would be findable now that we know what we're looking for. You've had the signature for 2 days. Have you found anything? Flamel considered him for a moment. Then he said, I have a theory. I am not ready to discuss it because I am not yet certain, and I do not speculate to people when the subject is as significant as this one. He paused. I will tell you, the signature is not European. The tradition it comes from is British, but of a lineage that goes back to a specific pre-modern school of magical practice. A school that was not widely known and that has not produced graduates in over 200 years. Another pause. I am making inquiries. Through what channel? The oldest one, Flamel said. A letter to someone who knew that school personally. Harry absorbed this. Someone Flamel could write to who had direct knowledge of a magical school that hadn't produced graduates in over 2 centuries. He did the arithmetic. Decided not to press. All right, he said. Thank you. For tonight. Flamel made a gesture that wasn't quite dismissive and wasn't quite acknowledgement, something that existed in the space between them as a kind of course. He walked Harry to the door and said, Sleep. The last binding comes off in the morning and you will want to be rested. Harry went back to Gryffindor Tower, climbed the stairs, lay down on his bed, and was asleep in approximately 90 seconds. He woke before anyone else and lay in the dark listening to 5 other people breathe and felt the difference. Not the fragment specifically, that absence had been immediate and total. But the cumulative effect of 25 bindings removed plus the fragment plus a night of deep sleep was something he could feel in the same way you could feel the change in air pressure when a storm cleared. He was, more. Not in an overwhelming sense, not in a way that felt dangerous or destabilizing. Just more present, more real, more fully Harry than he had been when he'd arrived at Hogwarts 7 weeks ago. He got up and went to Flitwick's classroom. Dr. Vass removed the final binding at 6:45 in the morning, while the castle was still in that suspended pre-breakfast quiet. She worked quickly, with the ease of someone handling a last detail rather than a complex problem, and when it came off Harry simply sat for a moment and felt everything settle into place. 31 bindings gone. 1 soul fragment gone. Dar. Vass packed her instruments for the last time, and she looked at Harry when she was done and said, For the record, in 20 years of this work, I have never seen a core like yours. She said it clinically, not reverently, which was why it landed the way it did. Whatever you choose to do with it, Mr. Potter, will matter. She picked up her satchel. I say that as a professional observation, not as pressure. You've had enough of that. She left. Harry sat alone in the classroom as the castle woke up around him, the sounds and movement of morning filtering through the stone, and held the completeness of what he was now. He thought, the tribunal notice arrives today. He thought, it gets complicated today. He went to breakfast. The tribunal notice arrived by ICW official post at 8:17 in the morning, landing in front of Albus Dumbledore at the head table with the precisely formal solemnity of official documents from international bodies that had decided they were done being patient. It was sealed with the full crest of the ICW, countersigned by the chief warlock of the Wisengamot in an act of institutional necessity that Amelia Bones had apparently arranged overnight, and it required Dumbledore's response within 72 hours. The Great Hall noticed, because the Great Hall noticed everything, and a document arriving at the head table with that kind of formal weight and that kind of seal was visible to anyone paying attention, which at Hogwarts was everyone above first year. Dumbledore looked at it for a moment, then tucked it beneath his plate and continued eating his porridge, and Harry, watching from the Gryffindor table, thought, there it is. That's the decision point. Whatever he does in the next 72 hours tells the story of who he actually is. Ron was eating toast and watching the head table with the focused peripheral vision of someone trying to appear casual. He's not even, Ron started. He's not going to react here, Harry said. He's much too good at this. That's worse somehow. Yes. Hermione arrived 4 minutes later, sat down, looked at the head table, looked at Harry, and said, the notice? Yes. She took a piece of toast and began buttering it with methodical precision. What happens now? Now Dumbledore decides how to play it, Harry said. He has 3 options. He contests the jurisdiction, argues the ICW doesn't have authority over a domestic matter. He cooperates fully and tries to manage the narrative from inside the process. Or he does something I haven't predicted yet. Which do you think? The second one, Harry said. He's too smart for the first and too invested in his reputation for the third. He paused. He'll cooperate. He'll be charming. He'll be reasonable. He'll present his version of events with complete apparent transparency, and his version will be internally coherent and genuinely difficult to argue with. He picked up his pumpkin juice. And then I testify. Hermione looked at him carefully. Are you going to be all right? Testifying against Dumbledore? I'm not testifying against anyone, Harry said. I'm testifying to what was done to me. Those are different things. She was quiet for a moment. You're not angry at him, she said. I didn't say that. But you're not, she paused. You're not letting it be the thing that drives you. No. He set down his juice. Because anger at him specifically would mean giving him the center of the story. And he's not the center of my story. He made a mistake, a large, sustained, legally consequential mistake that he genuinely believed was justified. The legal process can handle that. I don't need to. He paused. What I care about is making sure it's documented. Fully. Irrefutably. So that the next person, whoever comes after me, can't be managed the same way. Hermione stared at him for a long moment. What? He said. Nothing, she said. Eat your breakfast. Neville Longbottom found Harry in the corridor outside Transfiguration before the morning lesson and stood in his path with the expression of someone who had worked up to a conversation with considerable effort and intended to have it regardless. Harry stopped. Neville said, I heard something. His voice was quiet and careful. About the diagnostic. About what was found. He looked at Harry with large, serious eyes. Can they run it again? On someone else? Harry looked at him. He had noticed Neville before in the vague way you noticed someone who shared your classes and your dormitory, and he'd clocked several things. Neville was not unintelligent, despite what Neville clearly believed about himself. Neville was consistently startled when he succeeded at things, which suggested a baseline self-expectation of failure that was specifically constructed rather than naturally developed. Neville handled a wand with the particular tentativeness of someone who had been told for a long time that magic was difficult for him specifically. He thought about what Dr. Vass had said. These were placed by someone with precise knowledge of what you would have become without them. He thought about the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and what Amelia Bones had mentioned, almost in passing, about another family with connections to the last war who had suffered. He hadn't finished that sentence, had been interrupted, and Harry had filed it. Yes, Harry said. Dr. Vass is still in the castle. I can ask her today. Neville exhaled. The relief in it was complex, not just about getting an answer, but about being taken seriously without explanation. I don't know for certain, Neville said. I've always been. Gran says my magic is developing slowly. But it doesn't feel slow when I do it. It feels like it's pushing against something, Harry said. Neville looked at him. Yes. I know that feeling, Harry said. Come to Flitwick's classroom at lunch. I'll have it arranged. He went to Transfiguration. McGonagall ran the class without looking at him any differently than she looked at anyone else, which was the right call and he appreciated it, but twice he caught her watching him in the way that people who were carrying large amounts of guilt tended to watch the subject of that guilt, not with pity, which would have been insulting, but with a kind of careful attention that was its own form of apology. At the end of class, when the others left, she said, Potter, again. He stayed again. She stood at her desk for a moment, not looking at her papers, just standing. There will be a formal hearing, she said. ICW Tribunal. Dumbledore will appear. She paused. I have been asked to provide testimony regarding the governance of this school and the process by which student welfare is managed. Harry waited. I will tell the truth, she said. It didn't sound like an announcement. It sounded like someone making a decision that cost them something and making it anyway. I know, Harry said. It is, she stopped. It is not comfortable. He has been my colleague for 40 years. He has been, she stopped again. Jaw tight. I know, Harry said again, with slightly different weight. She looked up at him. How are you, Mr. Potter, she said, and this time it had none of the formal quality of the same question asked by officials and investigators. It was just a person asking. Better than I was, he said honestly. Clearer. A pause. It's a lot to process, but I'm not drowning in it. He met her eyes. I won't lie to you, what he did is difficult to square with who he appears to be. But I think the two things can be true simultaneously. He is genuinely that person and he did genuinely this thing. Both. He paused. I find that more useful to understand than to just be angry about. McGonagall looked at him for a long moment. You are 11 years old, she said, quietly, and not as a criticism this time. You could stop mentioning that, he said, gently. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile. Go to your next class, Mr. Potter. Dr. Vass ran Neville's diagnostic at lunch. Harry waited outside the classroom. He'd explained the situation briefly to Dr. Vass that morning, another student, suspected bindings, family with significant connections to the last war, and she'd agreed without hesitation. He didn't go in. This was Neville's thing, and Neville didn't need an audience. He waited in the corridor, leaning against the wall, eating half a sandwich he'd brought from the hall, feeling the castle move around him in its ongoing, enormous, ambient way. Hermione came and stood next to him with a book that she clearly wasn't going to read and said nothing, which was thoughtful of her. After 35 minutes, the door opened and Dr. Vass came out first. She looked at Harry, then at the corridor in both directions, then spoke quietly. 9, she said. Harry absorbed this. 9 bindings. 9. All placed in early childhood. Several of them, she paused. The structural profile is different from yours. Less about output suppression, more about confidence and instinct suppression. His magical ability is not extensively suppressed at the core level, it is accessible, but his belief in his ability to access it is comprehensively undermined. She met Harry's eyes. Someone made this boy believe he couldn't do magic. Very deliberately. Harry thought about Neville in charms, startled each time he succeeded. The tentativeness of the wand grip. He needs to know, Harry said. He already does, she said. He is, she paused. He is handling it. In his own way. Harry waited. Neville came out a few minutes later. He looked the way people looked after they'd received information that reorganized something fundamental, not devastated, not relieved, but in the middle of a recalibration that hadn't finished processing yet. He stopped in the corridor and stood there. Harry didn't say anything. He handed Neville the other half of the sandwich. Neville looked at it. Took it. Ate it in silence for a moment. 9, he said finally. Yeah. Gran's going to be, he stopped. Exhaled. She's going to be, furious, Harry said. Absolutely volcanic, Neville said. Something in his voice shifted on it, something cracked open slightly, and it wasn't distress, it was almost relief. Someone in his corner being furious on his behalf. She's going to come up here and, he stopped again, and his expression did something complicated. Do you think she knew? Gran? No, Harry said, with conviction. Not a chance. Neville looked at him. How can you be sure? Because you're here, Harry said. If she'd known, whatever was happening in that family, you'd still be somewhere safe with every binding removed, and whoever placed them would be in a very bad situation. He paused. Has your Gran ever struck you as someone who tolerates bad situations involving you? Neville thought about this. No, he said slowly. She definitely has not. Then she didn't know. Neville nodded once. Finished the sandwich. Stood a bit straighter in a way that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with something settling. Can they be removed? He asked Dr. Vass. Yes, she said. We begin tomorrow, if you consent. Yes, Neville said, without hesitation. Then he looked at Harry. Thank you, he said. You didn't have to, I know what it feels like, Harry said. To have someone take it seriously. He picked up his bag. Come to the hearing. When it happens. Yours will be part of it too, now, and it's better to be there. He went to his afternoon classes. The formal tribunal convened on Tuesday in the largest and used classroom on the 4th floor, which the ICW team had converted with quiet efficiency into something that looked considerably more institutional than its origins. A long table for the panel, Ionescu at the center, 2 additional ICW officials who had arrived Monday evening, and a representative of the Wiesengemot who looked like she would rather be anywhere else and was professional enough to do her job impeccably despite this. Amelia Bones sat at a separate table to the panel's right, representing the ministry's formal interest in the proceedings. Dumbledore arrived precisely on time, in deep blue robes, looking the way he always looked, unhurried, warm, the most reasonable person in any room he entered. He sat in the witness position with his hands folded and his expression composed into something that acknowledged the gravity of the situation without conceding anything about its framing. Harry sat in the gallery with Flitwick on one side and Neville on the other. Hermione was 3 seats down, with her notebook open despite having been told this was not a note-taking event, because she was Hermione. The tribunal's opening statements took 40 minutes. Ionescu read the full list of the 31 bindings, their dates, their types, and their effects into the formal record with the monotone precision of someone who had learned that plain recitation of facts was more devastating than any rhetorical approach to them. Somewhere in the middle of the list, around binding number 14, Harry heard someone in the gallery draw a sharp breath. He didn't look to see who. Then Dumbledore was invited to respond. He did so with the full weight of his considerable gifts, and they were genuine. That was the thing Harry had already decided to hold on to, because pretending they weren't would be the same mistake as pretending the bindings weren't. He spoke about the prophecy. He spoke about Voldemort's return being a question of when, not if. He spoke about the specific danger of a child of Harry's evident magical potential growing up with full access to that potential in a world where dark wizards were still operating, where every unusual magical signature was a beacon, where Harry's safety depended on his appearing to be, and largely being, ordinary. It was coherent. It was internally consistent. It was the argument of someone who had spent the years since making those decisions building an airtight justification for them, and who believed it with the complete conviction of someone who had never once allowed themselves to imagine that the child on the other end of the decision might have preferred to be asked. Ionescu listened without expression. When Dumbledore finished, Ionescu said, "Thank you, Headmaster. Your reasoning has been recorded in full." A pause. "I want to be certain the panel understands one aspect clearly. The bindings in question were placed on a child who was, at the time of their placement, an infant and then a young child without magical knowledge or legal capacity to consent to modifications of his core. The question before this panel is not whether the reasoning you've described is compelling. It may be. The question is whether any reasoning justifies the unilateral, secret modification of a child's magical core without consent, without oversight, without documentation, and without reversal as the child aged and circumstances changed." He let that sit for a moment. "You will agree, Headmaster, that at no point were the bindings revisited, adjusted, or discussed with Mr. Potter as he grew." "That is correct," Dumbledore said, steadily. "At no point were they documented with any regulatory body. No. At no point was Mr. Potter himself informed of their existence, despite arriving at an age and an institution where he might have been told." Dumbledore paused for the first time. "Just briefly." "No," he said. "Thank you." Ionescu made a note. "We will hear from our next witness." Harry walked to the front. He sat in the witness position. The room was very quiet. He was aware of it in a complete, layered way that he was now aware of all physical spaces, the ambient presence of 20-odd people, the particular quality of attention in the room, Dumbledore across from him at the respondent table with his hands still folded and his expression still composed. Harry looked at him. Then he looked at Ionescu. "I'll tell you what I remember," he said. "And what I didn't, until recently." He spoke for 40 minutes. He was not performative. He was not angry, not theatrical, not trying to be. He described what growing up had felt like from the inside, the accidental magic that had always felt like pressure escaping, the moments of capacity that had frightened him because he'd had no framework for them, the first weeks at Hogwarts where magic had felt like something he was allowed to do but only up to a specific ceiling he couldn't locate. He described the diagnostic, what Flitwick had found, what the removal process had been like, and what the difference between before and after felt like. He described the soul fragment. At this, the Wisingamot representative made a sound and wrote something down with considerable force. He described what he'd noticed about his own behavior changing with each removal, the feather he'd called across the room, the way the castle had come into focus, the troll, the corridor, all of it. He described it as information, not accusation. Then Ionescu said, "Mr. Potter. How do you wish to characterize what was done to you?" Harry thought about this. "As a decision made about me," he said, "without me. By someone who had decided that the outcome they wanted justified removing my ability to choose it myself." He paused. "I understand the reasoning. I don't agree with it. And I think the most important thing this panel can record is not that what was done was malicious, I don't believe it was, specifically, but that good intentions are not a substitute for consent. Especially when the person the intentions concern is a child who grows into someone capable of their own decisions." He looked at Ionescu steadily. "I can tell you that I would not have consented. I can tell you that because I know who I am now, with everything removed, and I would not have traded this for any amount of safety Dumbledore's version of me was meant to provide." The room was still. "Thank you, Mr. Potter," Ionescu said. Harry stood up and went back to the gallery. He did not look at Dumbledore as he passed. He sat down next to Flitwick, who was looking at the panel table with an expression of professional composure that didn't fully conceal what was going on underneath it, and Neville, who was staring at his own hands in the way of someone who had heard everything Harry said and was filing it against his own experience. McGonagall testified next. She did not hedge. She did not equivocate. She described the governance structure of Hogwarts, the process by which student welfare concerns were reported to the headmaster, the fact that Dumbledore's word on any matter involving a student was effectively final within the school structure. She described the absence of any independent welfare oversight. She described, and here her voice was entirely controlled and entirely devastating, the fact that she had trusted the headmaster's judgment in student welfare matters for 40 years without independent verification because she had had no reason to doubt him, and that she understood now this trust had been misplaced, and that she would not repeat the mistake. Dumbledore listened to this with the still expression of someone absorbing a blow they had known was coming and had prepared themselves for, which didn't mean it didn't land. Flitwick testified last on the faculty side, brief, precise, the facts of the diagnostic and his decision-making process, recorded in full. He answered every question without decoration. The tribunal panel deliberated for 2 hours. During this time the castle went about its afternoon, classes, dinner preparations, the specific ambient life of a working school, and Harry walked the grounds with Ron and Hermione and Neville, the 4 of them occupying the wide sweep of lawn near the lake in the low November sun. Ron had been quiet since the testimony ended, not in a troubled way but in the processing way that Harry had learned was Ron working something through to completion before he said it. He arrived at completion somewhere near the lake's edge. The thing about him, Ron said, is that he's not wrong, exactly. About the danger. You know. He looked at Harry carefully. Voldemort is real. The threat is real. That's not invented. No, Harry agreed. But he decided the answer to a real threat was to take everything away from the person it was aimed at. Ron kicked a stone into the water. And then put that person in charge of fixing it anyway. Just, smaller. Just with less. He shook his head. That doesn't even make sense strategically, does it? If you need someone to face a real threat, you'd want them at full capacity. Unless, Hermione said slowly, you don't want them at full capacity when they face it. Ron looked at her. Unless you want them capable enough to succeed, she said, but not so capable that they then become, she paused. Hard to control afterward, Neville finished. They all looked at him. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention but clearly not going to retract the observation. I'm just saying. Gran always said that the people who won the last war were harder to manage after than anyone expected. And that made certain people nervous. He looked at Harry. Maybe that's the actual calculation. Not just protect you going in. But make sure there's enough of you left to manage coming out. The lake moved quietly. The something vast underneath it was near the surface, a slow enormous presence just below the water's tension. Harry looked at the lake. That's the most cynical reading, he said. Is it wrong? Neville said. A pause. No, Harry said. Hermione sat down on the bank, book apparently forgotten. What does the panel decide? What's the actual outcome? The bindings are already gone, Harry said. So the remediation is done. The formal outcome is about accountability and about setting precedent, what the statutes say about what was done, what the consequences are for Dumbledore specifically, and what mechanisms get put in place to prevent it happening again. Will he lose his positions? Ron asked. Supreme Mugwump. Headmaster. All of it? I don't know, Harry said. And I'm not sure I need to. They all looked at him. I mean it, he said. The tribunal deciding what happens to Dumbledore is the tribunal's job. My job is, he stopped, reconsidered, started again. My thing is this, I have 31 bindings removed, a soul fragment gone, and the first time in my life that I know who I actually am. He paused. I'd like to figure that out. The rest of it, the politics, the consequences, that's real and it matters, but it's not mine to carry. You're very zen for someone who was basically dismantled and reassembled this week, Ron said. I'm going to fall apart about it eventually, Harry said. Just not today. Ron nodded. Fair enough. The panel reconvened at 6 o'clock. Ionescu read the findings into the formal record with the same flat precision he'd used all day, and the findings were comprehensive. Albus Dumbledore had violated 11 ICW statutes governing the magical treatment of minors. The panel found no evidence that the violations had been motivated by malice, and recorded this explicitly. They also found, explicitly, that this did not mitigate the violations. The precedent they were setting, that intent did not substitute for consent, that the welfare of a magical child could not be subordinated to any strategic consideration however compelling, was recorded as formal ICW doctrine applicable to all member nations. Dumbledore would be suspended from his role as Supreme Mugwump pending a full Wisengamot review. His role as Headmaster of Hogwarts would be subject to a Board of Governors review with ICW oversight. A formal independent welfare body for British wizarding students would be established within 30 days. Dumbledore stood and received all of this without visible distress, which Harry found more unsettling than distress would have been. He thanked the panel. He was courteous to Ionescu. He was courteous to Amelia Bones. He was, in every external particular, the man everyone believed him to be. And then he looked at Harry, briefly, across the room. It was not a threatening look. It was not calculating or cold. It was something more difficult than either of those things. It was the look of someone who had done what they'd done completely and genuinely believing it was right, and who now had to sit with the fact that a room full of witnesses disagreed, and who was still not certain they were wrong. Harry met his eyes. He didn't look away. He didn't offer reassurance or hostility or anything in between. He just looked back with the full, clear attention of someone who saw all of it, the genuine belief, the genuine damage, the genuine inability to tell the difference between protection and control, and let it be what it was. Dumbledore looked away first. Not in defeat, not exactly. In something more like a man beginning a very long reckoning with himself. Harry went back to Gryffindor Tower. He sat in the window seat with the castle humming around him, vast and warm and old, and he looked out at the dark grounds and thought about 31 locks on a door and what was on the other side of them. Ron brought him a plate of food from dinner because Harry had missed it. He ate. He was grateful. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning, just a few flakes, tentative and slow, settling on the dark surface of the lake and vanishing into it. The castle watched it happen. So did Harry. Chapter 5, The Third Party. The letter from Flamel arrived Wednesday morning, 3 days after the tribunal. It was not addressed to Harry. It was addressed to Flitwick, which was how Harry knew it was significant. Flamel was too deliberate a man to misdirect correspondence. He sent it to Flitwick because whatever was in it required someone with institutional standing to receive it first, and because whatever came next needed a buffer between the information and the 11-year-old it concerned. Flitwick found Harry at breakfast and said, very quietly, "My office. When you're done." Harry ate quickly and went. The letter was on Flitwick's desk, parchment thick and old, Flamel's handwriting running in the cramped, precise script of someone who'd spent 6 centuries conserving ink. Flitwick had already read it. He was standing by his window when Harry came in, looking at the grounds with his hands behind his back. "He found the third party," Harry said. "He did." Flitwick turned around. His expression was doing several things simultaneously. "Sit down, Harry." Harry sat. He noticed Flitwick had used his first name without the customary Mr. Potter, and he noted what that indicated about the nature of what was coming. Flitwick sat across from him and looked at him carefully before speaking. "What do you know about Lily Potter?" Harry looked at him. "My mother. She was killed when I was 1. She was a witch. Muggle-born. Apparently exceptionally talented." He paused. "That's approximately the sum of it. The Dursleys don't talk about her. Flitwick nodded once, slowly. I knew her, he said. She was in this school. She was one of the finest students I ever taught, and I've taught for a very long time. He paused. She had a gift for charms it was the kind of gift that makes a teacher understand that what they're doing for a living actually matters. Something moved through his voice on that. He let it, and then set it aside. She was also, in her final years, deeply engaged in independent research. Theoretical work, very advanced. She was interested in soul magic. Harry went still. Not the dark applications, Flitwick said quickly. The opposite. She was trying to understand soul magic from a protective standpoint, specifically, whether ancient pre-modern techniques could be adapted to create magical protections that couldn't be countered by conventional dark magic. He paused. She was corresponding with Flamel in the last year of her life. He tells me he encouraged the research. He tells me he provided source materials. Another pause. He also tells me that the structural signature of the 11 unidentified bindings is consistent, in every analytical detail he can identify, with Lily Potter's theoretical framework. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the snow that had started Tuesday night had continued, thin and steady, and the grounds were white now, the lake a dark mirror in the middle of all that pale. My mother, Harry said. Yes. She placed 11 bindings on me. Before her death, yes. Flamel estimates, based on the soul fragment containment binding's freshness at the time of placement, that at least one was placed on the night of the attack itself, or within days of it. Flitwick's voice was very careful now, carrying the information the way you carried something breakable. The others predate that, placed during your infancy, consistent with someone who was aware of a specific threat and taking every precaution available to them. Harry sat with this. He thought about the night in Flamel's prepared room, the binding coming off the soul fragment, the careful redundant construction Dr. Vaz had described, someone who was frightened for him specifically. He thought about what Flamel had said, this is not the work of a researcher or an agent. It is the work of someone who was frightened for him specifically. Someone who had known what was coming. Who had spent the last year of her life building protections with medieval scholarship sourced from a 6-century-old alchemist, and had placed the last one on the night she died. His mother had done more to protect him in the last year of her life than he'd known. More, in several specific and magical senses, than anyone else. He breathed out once, slow and level. The soul fragment containment, he said. Yes. Flamel believed she was aware of Voldemort's soul fragmentation. She understood what the rebounding curse would do. The fragment anchor was the kind of secondary effect she would have predicted from her theoretical framework. Flitwick's voice was even. She couldn't stop the fragment attaching. She could contain it. She had maybe minutes. A pause. She used them. Harry's hands were flat on his knees. He was very still, not fighting anything, just letting it arrive at its full weight without flinching away from it. Then the protection she provided that night, he said slowly. The one everyone says killed Voldemort's body, that wasn't just a mother's love as magic. That was a prepared working. Flitwick blinked. Then he looked at Harry with the specific expression of someone encountering a conclusion they should have reached themselves. That is, he stopped. Yes. Flamel does not say that explicitly in the letter but, he paused. Yes. I think that is exactly what it was. The sacrifice component was real and was essential, but the sacrifice alone, he stopped again. The sacrifice alone doesn't rebound a killing curse, Harry said. Not with that kind of completeness. Not well enough to destroy a body. She built a ritual working around the sacrifice. She knew she was going to die and she used it. He paused. She went into that room with a prepared protection on me and no wand and she stayed there, and she used the only variable she had left. Flitwick was looking at him with something that was not quite the professional composure he usually wore. It was something older and less managed. She was brilliant, Flitwick said quietly. I want you to know that. Not as comfort. As simple fact. Harry nodded. He didn't trust his voice for a moment, so he didn't use it. He sat in Flitwick's office and let it settle into him, not the grief, which he'd get to in his own time, but the specific, clarifying knowledge that she had known. Had prepared. Had made choices in her last hours that were strategic and loving simultaneously, and had died leaving every protection she could construct between her son and the world. He thought, she placed 11 bindings on me and Dumbledore placed 4 and she was trying to protect me and he was trying to control me and both of them thought they were doing the same thing. He thought, the difference between those two things is everything. Does Flamel know if she left anything else? Harry said. Notes. Research. Letters. Flitwick picked up the letter again. He says, yes. He kept her correspondence. All of it. He says he has been waiting for a reason to know what to do with it and that he now has one. He looked up. He would like to meet with you before he leaves the country. This afternoon, if you're willing. Yes, Harry said. Flamel was packing when Harry arrived at the prepared room, the old instruments wrapped in cloth and nested back into their leather case with the practiced care of someone who'd been packing and unpacking the same equipment for centuries. The containment vessel holding the soul fragment was sealed inside a secondary case that was warded in 3 different ways, and sat apart from everything else on the table the way dangerous things had a quality of sitting apart even when they were physically restrained. He didn't stop packing when Harry came in. He said, sit, and Harry sat, and Flamel continued folding cloth around instruments and placing them with the deliberate economy of a man who didn't waste motion. Flitwick told you, he said. Yes. And I want to know what she left, Harry said. Flamel reached into the inner pocket of his traveling robes and produced a bundle of letters tied with a piece of practical brown string. He set them on the table in front of Harry. Harry looked at them. The parchment was slightly yellowed, the ink visible even through the outermost fold. Her handwriting, he'd never seen his mother's handwriting before. It was neat, quick, practical, with the occasional word underlined in what read as emphasis rather than decoration. These are copies, Flamel said. The originals remain with me. I made copies this morning for you specifically. He looked at Harry directly. She was aware that what she was doing would be unknown to you for years. She wrote, not in these letters, but in a separate document she sent with the last communication, a letter intended for you. To be given when the bindings were removed. He paused. She knew the bindings would be removed eventually. She built them to be removable. That was deliberate, she did not want to limit you permanently. She only wanted to give you time to reach an age where your capacity wouldn't make you a target before you were ready. Unlike Dumbledore's, Harry said. Unlike Dumbledore's, which had no self-limiting architecture. Which were designed to be permanent unless actively removed by someone with the knowledge to do so. Flamel's voice was measured. She knew about his bindings. She disagreed with them. She could not remove them without his knowledge, they were sealed in a way that would have alerted him. He paused. She worked around them. The protective bindings she placed were designed to interact with his suppression bindings in specific ways, to ensure that even suppressed, you retained certain core instincts that he had not accounted for. Harry thought about the threat assessment instinct that Dr. Vass had found. Most people don't have this. Bound by Dumbledore, but apparently left partially functional because something was interacting with the binding in a way that preserved a minimum threshold. She hacked his bindings, Harry said. Flamel looked at him for a moment. I am not familiar with that term in this context. She worked around them. Used them. Made them serve a secondary purpose they weren't designed for. Yes, Flamel said. That is accurate. Something in his expression suggested this was a description of Lily Potter that would not have surprised him. She was that precise. He reached into his case one more time and produced a second envelope, this one sealed with wax and a small sigil Harry didn't recognize. He set it on top of the bundle of letters. The letter for you, he said. She sent it to me in the last correspondence, with instructions. Give this to my son when he is free. Those were the exact words. He looked at Harry. I will leave you now. Take as long as you need. He picked up his main leather case and walked to the door, and then paused. Mr. Potter, he said, without turning around. Yes. She wrote to me 14 times in the last year of her life. Every letter was about you. Not about the war, not about Voldemort, not about any of the other things happening around her. About you specifically, what you would need, what you would become, how to build the best possible protection for the specific person she already knew you were. He paused. I have received a great deal of correspondence in 600 years. Those 14 letters are among the most remarkable I have kept. He opened the door. She would not be surprised by any of this. I want you to know that. He left. Harry sat alone in the room with the bundle of letters and the sealed envelope and the first snow of the year settling outside the window, and he opened the envelope. He didn't read it to anyone. He wouldn't, not fully, not for a long time. But some things in it clarified others. She had known about the prophecy before it was officially recorded. She had her own source, someone inside the unspeakables who owed her a debt, and she'd had 18 months of preparation rather than Dumbledore's version of events where everything had been reactive. She'd spent those 18 months building. She'd known Dumbledore would try to manage Harry. She'd written about it with something that read as clear-eyed frustration rather than anger. He cannot stop himself from treating people as instruments, even when he loves them, and he will love Harry in his way. She'd planned around it. She'd written about Harry's father, about James, who she described as the most genuinely decent person she'd ever known, who had agreed with her about the bindings and disagreed with Dumbledore loudly and often and who had, in the end, trusted her to build what needed building while he stood at the door. She'd written about what she expected Harry to be. Not in a grand, prophetic way. In specific, practical ways. He will be direct, I think. James is direct and I am direct, and whatever else he gets from either of us, I expect he'll be able to look at a thing and call it what it is. That may be difficult for people who prefer things to be other than what they are. She'd been right. At the very end, she'd written, I know I won't be there. I've known for months. I've stopped being sad about it and started being practical, which is either coping or character, probably both. What I want you to know, Harry, is that the things I placed in you were not shackles. They were a bridge from here to there, from an age where you couldn't protect yourself to one where you could. I hope you're furious that they're gone. I hope you're everything I think you are. I hope you're free. Harry sat with the letter for a long time. Then he folded it carefully, put it in his inner robe pocket, and went to find his friends. He found them in the library, because of course he did, Ron working through a transfiguration essay with the focused misery of someone tackling a necessary unpleasant task, Hermione reading something that wasn't homework, Neville copying notes in his newly deliberate handwriting. Harry sat down. They looked at him. He looked back. Something in his face told them this had been significant and that he was all right and that he would tell them when he was ready. Ron passed him a quill. Neville pushed a blank piece of parchment his direction. Hermione lowered her book. Flamel found the third party, Harry said. Who was it? Hermione asked. My mother. The library was quiet around them. Madame Pants moved somewhere in the stacks. A first-year Hufflepuff sneezed. Lily Potter, Hermione said softly. She spent the last year of her life building protections. She corresponded with Flamel. She placed 11 bindings on me with medieval soul magic scholarship, designed to be removable when I was old enough, and one of them contained the soul fragment from the night she died. Harry looked at the table. She knew what was coming. She prepared for it. Ron didn't say anything for a moment. Then, she sounds brilliant. She was, Harry said. I have her letters to Flamel. I have a letter she left for me. Another silence. The protection on the night of the attack, Hermione said slowly, and Harry could see her working it out in real time, the same logic track he'd run in Flitwick's office. The rebounding curse. The sacrifice magic. That wasn't, she prepared that, didn't she? Yes. Hermione closed her book entirely. She built a ritual working and used her own death as the activation component. She said it quietly, with the specific tone she used when encountering something that was simultaneously terrible and impressive in equal measure. I've read about sacrificial magic in theory, but I've never seen a documented case that was prepared. Usually it's circumstantial. She made it deliberate. She was that precise, Harry said, borrowing Flamel's phrase. Neville was looking at his notes without reading them. Do you think whoever placed my bindings, he started, and then stopped, and then started again more carefully. Do you think there's someone in my history who knew? The same way she knew? Harry looked at him. I think your grandmother is the person to ask about that, he said. Honestly. And I think she's going to need to be told about all of this very soon. Amelia Bones is going to contact her, Neville said. Dr. Vass said the ministry is obligated to notify family. Will you be all right when she comes? Neville thought about it. Yes, he said, and the steadiness in it was different from the way he'd said yes to things 6 weeks ago. Less tentative. Like someone who'd discovered the floor was solid. Augusta Longbottom arrived on Thursday. She came through the front gates on foot despite the snow, because Augusta Longbottom did not apparate to places she could walk into with proper authority. She was tall and bony, wore robes of deep green that hadn't changed in style since roughly 1975 and wore them with total conviction, and she had a face that had been doing the expression of absolute composure over barely contained fury for so long that the lines were settling in permanently. She went to Amelia Bones first. Harry knew this because Amelia's dollish came to find Flitwick with the tight expression of someone conveying a message that needed careful framing, and the message was essentially there is a formidable woman in the second-floor guest room and she would like to see the diagnostic results and then she would like to see her grandson. Flitwick relayed this to Harry because Harry had been with Flitwick when Dawlish arrived, and Flitwick said, "You don't need to be involved in this." "I know," Harry said. "But I'd like to be, if Neville wants me there." He checked with Neville, who said, with the air of someone who loved their grandmother and was also very aware of her formidable dimensions, "Yes. Please. Anchor." So Harry stood at the back of the room when Augusta Longbottom received the full picture. She sat in a chair across from Amelia and Dr. Vass and she received the information about Neville's 9 bindings, their nature, their dates, their effects, with a stillness that was the opposite of inattention. She was processing at considerable speed. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her expression did not change. When Dr. Vass finished, Augusta was quiet for 10 seconds. Then she said, "The signatures. You have identified them?" "Partially," Dr. Vass said. "We are working on the remaining. I know who placed them," Augusta said. The room's quality of attention changed. "Albus Dumbledore placed 2 of them," she said, with the flat precision of someone reading from an internal document they had been maintaining for years. "I suspected this for some time. I had no way to prove it and he is," she paused, and the lines around her mouth deepened fractionally, "he is not a man easily confronted without evidence." She looked at Amelia directly. "The others are the work of someone who had access to Neville during his first year of life and who I believe was acting under instructions that I was not aware of at the time." "Who?" Amelia said. "My late husband's brother," Augusta said. "Algy." Amelia wrote something. "He is still alive," Augusta said. He is not a malicious man, I want to be clear about that. He is a man who did what he was told by someone he trusted implicitly, without questioning whether he should, and he has been living with whatever that has cost him ever since." She paused. "He will cooperate fully. I will make certain of it." "Augusta," Amelia said carefully. "Are you suggesting that the bindings placed by Algy Longbottom were placed under Dumbledore's direction?" Augusta looked at her. I am suggesting that Albus Dumbledore had a vision of what the Longbottom heir should be, and the timeline and the method are consistent with that vision being imposed rather than allowed to develop. A pause. I am also suggesting that for 30 years I have watched my grandson believe he was inadequate, watched him flinch from his own magic, watched him carry a sense of failure that I could not dislodge no matter what I did, and that I now understand precisely why, and I am. She stopped. Neville, in the corner, was very still. Augusta turned and looked at him directly. Her expression did something very private and very significant. I owe you an apology, she said. I should have looked harder. Gran, Neville started. I should have looked harder, she said again, firmly, allowing no mitigation. The signs were there. I chose to believe the problem was developmental. I did not investigate far enough. Her voice was entirely level. That changes today. Neville crossed the room and sat down next to her, and she put one hand briefly over his in a gesture that was brisk and warm simultaneously, very Augusta, and then she straightened and turned back to Amelia. What needs to happen next, she said, and what do you need from me? Harry watched from the back of the room. He was aware of Neville's ambient emotional register, the complicated layered thing of someone grieving something lost and being simultaneously relieved that it was found, and being grateful, and being angry, and having all of those things held by the presence of someone who loved them enough to say I should have looked harder and mean it fully. He thought about his mother's letter. He thought, some people prepare the world as best they can for the people they love. Some people investigate when they should. Some people fail and say so. The machinery of care is imperfect and inconsistent and sometimes comes too late, and it matters anyway. Ionescu found Harry in the corridor outside the library that afternoon. Walk with me, the investigator said, which was less a suggestion than a statement of what was happening. They walked. The castle corridors were quieter in the afternoons when most students were in class, just the occasional older student moving between study sessions, the ambient sounds of a building that had been occupied for 1,000 years and remembered all of it. I'm leaving Friday, Ionescu said. The formal record is complete, the tribunal findings are sealed, the ICW has what it needs to proceed with Dumbledore's review. He paused. Dr. Vass is staying through Neville Longbottom's removal process. Mr. Reyes will remain as documentation liaison for the Board of Governors review. He glanced sideways at Harry. I want to brief you on what I believe is coming next. Not from an official position. Just from experience. All right, Harry said. Dumbledore will cooperate with the ICW review. He will be professional, thorough, and he will present his case with every legitimate argument available to him. Some of those arguments will be compelling enough that the final outcome is not the full removal of all his positions. Ionescu paused. He is too woven into the institutional structure of British wizarding life for a clean excision. What will happen is more like a restructuring, oversight mechanisms, independent welfare monitoring, restrictions on his direct authority over students. He paused. He will remain headmaster, almost certainly. At least initially. Harry nodded. He'd expected something like this. And the stone? Ionescu looked at him. The stone is a Flammel family matter. He is collecting it when he leaves. The arrangement whereby it was kept here was irregular, and the ICW has made its position on that clear to both parties. He paused. Your concern is presumably not the stone itself but what guarding the stone was being used as. A test, Harry said. A stage. It was a trap designed to look like a challenge. Yes. We have documented this as part of the wider record of how your time at Hogwarts was structured. Ionescu's voice was level. The entity you detected in the North Corridor, we have assessed it. Quirrell is being managed at the ministry level through a separate channel. He will not remain at Hogwarts. He won't survive the removal, Harry said. Ionescu looked at him. Voldemort is using him, Harry said. Using his body as a host. When Quirrell is removed from the situation, either removed from the castle or confronted, the host won't survive the separation. He paused. I'm not saying that's a reason not to act. I'm saying Quirrell needs to know what's happening to him, if he doesn't already. He might have a choice in there. Ionescu studied him for a long moment. You're suggesting that Quirinus Quirrell may be as much a victim of this situation as you were. I'm suggesting it's worth finding out, Harry said. Before anyone makes an irreversible decision about his future. They walked in silence for a moment. I'm going to say something to you, Ionescu said eventually, that I do not say in my professional capacity. I say it as a person who has done this work for 30 years and has seen a great many children at the center of terrible situations. Harry waited. Most children in your position, Ionescu paused, choosing words with unusual care, are consumed by what was done to them. Understandably. It becomes the organizing principle of how they see everything, themselves, other people, the world. It defines them for years. He paused. You are doing something different. You are filing it in the correct place. You are not letting it be larger than it is, and you are not letting it be smaller than it is. You are looking at Quirrell and seeing a possibly coerced person rather than an extension of the threat against you. He paused again. That is not normal. It is not what I expect. I want you to know that I've noticed it. Harry walked for a moment before responding. My mother spent her last year being practical instead of sad, he said. I think that's probably genetic. Something happened in Ionescu's face that was brief and real and then professional again. The ICW investigation will remain active, he said. We are pursuing the question of Voldemort's other soul fragments. That is above your involvement. You are 11, Mr. Potter, and that is one area where I am comfortable saying that this particular problem is for adults to handle, and you should allow us to handle it. Fair, Harry said. We are also pursuing the full scope of Dumbledore's reasoning, specifically, who else may have been similarly managed. Neville Longbottom is almost certainly not the only one. He paused. This investigation is not over. It has barely begun in the wider sense. Harry looked at him. What do you need from me for the wider sense? Nothing right now, Ionescu said. Live your life. Go to your classes. Be 11, in the ways that are available to you. He glanced at Harry with a look that acknowledged the specific limitations of that advice given the specific person it was aimed at. Or be whatever you actually are. I'm not going to be the 12th person this week to tell you what you should be. That's the best thing anyone said to me in days, Harry said. Ionescu stopped walking. They were at the top of a staircase, the castle spread below them in all directions, the afternoon light coming through high windows in long amber bars across the stone floor. One last thing, Ionescu said. The letters from your mother, and the theoretical framework she built, Flamel has recommended that they be properly archived and studied. Not by anyone at Hogwarts. By an independent magical research body. He paused. He specifically recommended that you be involved in deciding where they go. Not the ICW, not the Ministry, not Hogwarts. You. Harry looked at him. She built them for you, Ionescu said simply. What happens to them next should be your call. He went back down the corridor, leaving Harry at the top of the stairs. Harry stood there for a moment, thinking about the letters in Flamel's case and the copy of his mother's letter in his own pocket and what it meant to have custody of something. Not just something, her work. Her thinking. The 14 letters she'd written to a 600-year-old alchemist about her son. He thought about what she would want. He thought, she'd want it used. She'd want it to matter. She'd want someone to take the theory and push it further, not as a monument to her, but as a continuation. He thought about Hermione, who had sent research questions to Nicholas Flamel at age 11 and received a detailed reply, and who was currently in the library finding answers to questions no one had thought to ask yet. He went to the library. He put the bundle of letters on the table in front of Hermione. She looked at them. Looked at him. Flamel's copies? Yes. My mother's research correspondence. He sat down. I want you to read them. Hermione's hand stopped above the bundle without touching it. Harry, she'd want them studied, he said. Not just kept. She was a researcher. She built a working theoretical framework for protective soul magic from pre-modern sources, and she used it to save my life, and nobody's picked up where she left off because nobody knew it existed. He paused. You're the person I trust to pick it up correctly. I'm 11, Hermione said, with the air of someone using a phrase they'd heard used recently. I know, he said. You've got time. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the bundle with both hands, the careful way she handled things that mattered, and held it in her lap. Ron, she said. Ron, who had been watching this exchange from behind his essay with studied casualness, looked up. Yeah. I'm going to need you to cover for me in the common room for approximately the next several evenings, she said. I'll be reading. When aren't you reading? Ron said. I'll be reading this, she said, with sufficient weight that Ron sat up slightly. Right, he said. Covered. Harry looked at both of them. He thought about what Ionescu had said, live your life, go to your classes, be whatever you actually are, and he thought about the specific shape of what he actually was, which was becoming clearer with each day. Someone who gathered people with complementary capacities and trusted them with significant things, not because he needed them to perform those things for him but because the combination of different capabilities was more interesting and more effective than any single person operating alone. He thought, my mother built her protection by corresponding with Flamel and planning with my father and working alone in the final moment. She built it from multiple sources. That's how you build anything that lasts. He thought about the remaining threads, Quirrell, the other Horcruxes, the Board of Governors review, whatever Dumbledore was planning in the quiet of his reckoning, and he felt the weight of them without being crushed by them. They were the next problems. They would be solved as problems, in order, with the right people and the right information and the specific application of what he actually was. He picked up his Charms textbook and opened it to the chapter he'd been working through, and he read it now with the eyes of someone who understood not just what the text was saying but the deeper structural logic underneath the spell mechanics, and the chapter that had taken him 30 minutes last week took him 10, and the comprehension was complete rather than approximate. Neville came in at 4:30 with his herbology notes and sat down without ceremony, and the four of them occupied the table in the warm, book-smelling quiet of the library while outside the snow came down steadily and the castle held them all with its enormous old attention. At some point Hermione looked up from the first of Lily Potter's letters and said, softly, Harry. He looked at her over his textbook. She was extraordinary, Hermione said. I know, he said. This theory, she stopped. Started again. This is going to take years to fully develop. Decades, maybe. But the foundation is, she stopped again, and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts grief and excitement and something he recognized as the specific feeling of encountering something that mattered. It's right. The framework is right. I can feel that it's right even without being able to verify all of it yet. Then verify it, he said. Take as long as you need. She looked back down at the letter. Harry went back to his textbook. The castle settled around them in the winter afternoon, vast and warm, holding a library full of children who were figuring out what came next. Outside, the snow kept falling, thin and steady and patient, covering the grounds in white. Chapter 6, A New Equation. December came into Hogwarts the way it always did, cold and sudden and transformative, the castle shifting into its winter register with a kind of institutional enthusiasm that the students either loved or found oppressive depending on their personal relationship with darkness and frost. Harry found he loved it. The magic of the castle ran differently in winter. He could feel it more clearly now, the heating charms layered into the oldest stones, the protective wards at every exterior wall running with slightly more energy against the cold, the way the ambient magical field of the building compressed inward when the temperature dropped, becoming denser, more present. Walking the corridors in December was like walking through something alive and awake and in a good mood about it. He was in the corridor outside the defense classroom on the first Monday of December when the door didn't open on time, and the students gathered outside in the usual impatient cluster, and 5 minutes past the bell a nervous-looking deputy administrator from the headmaster's office appeared and said that Professor Quirrell was unwell and class was cancelled. Nobody asked follow-up questions. Most of them were relieved. Quirrell's classes were an exercise in managed anxiety, every lesson built around the theme of "here are things you should be frightened of" delivered by a man who couldn't get through a sentence without the stuttering. The Gryffindors dispersed toward the common room or the library with the unearned freedom energy of an unexpected gap in the schedule. Harry went to find Amelia Bones. She was still in the castle, had been, in a semi-permanent capacity, since the tribunal, managing the ongoing documentation and the Board of Governors process through Dawlish, eating in the Great Hall with the quiet authority of someone who had decided that being visible was more useful than being discreet. Harry found her in the second-floor guest room, standing at the window with a cup of tea, looking at the grounds with the expression of someone waiting for a thing they'd set in motion to complete its motion. "Quirrell," he said. "Yes," she said. "Is he all right?" She looked at him with the specific quality of attention she used when calibrating how much to say. "He was removed from the castle late last night," she said. "By ministry personnel operating through a joint channel with the ICW. He is currently in St. Mungo's, in the specialist ward." She paused. "He is alive." And? Another pause. "The entity using him as a host has been separated. The process was," she stopped. "Difficult. Quirrell sustained significant magical trauma. Whether he will make a full recovery is not yet known." Harry looked at the window. Snow on the grounds, thin winter light. He knew what was happening to him, he said. "Not a question exactly. We believed so, yes. The assessment team found evidence of conscious resistance, ongoing, sustained attempts to limit what the entity could access through him." She paused. "It made the separation more viable than it otherwise would have been. His own resistance preserved enough of his autonomous magical structure that there was something to work with." Harry thought about Quirrell standing at the front of a classroom, frightened every moment of every day, not of the things he was teaching his students to fear but of what he was carrying. Teaching defense against the dark arts while occupied by the darkest thing in living memory, fighting it from the inside with whatever he had. "I hope he recovers," Harry said. "So do I," Amelia said, and meant it in a way that had nothing official in it. "The fragment of Voldemort, what remains of him, is it gone?" "Dispersed," she said. "Without the Philosopher's Stone, without a host body, without the soul fragment that had been anchoring him through you, what remained was insufficient to maintain coherent existence. The entity that was removed from Quirrell was," she paused again, "significantly diminished. The assessment team's characterization was that it was a very long way from the Voldemort of 10 years ago. But not gone entirely," Harry said. "Probably not," she said. "The other fragments remain. Until they are found and destroyed, the possibility of reconstitution exists." She looked at him steadily. "But we have removed from the board the immediate threat that was living in this school 6 meters above your dormitory, so I will take that as progress." "Fair," he said. She set down her tea. "The Board of Governors convenes on Wednesday. The review of Dumbledore's role as headmaster begins formally then. I expect the process to take several weeks, and I expect the outcome to be complicated." She said this with the dry economy of someone very familiar with the word. "He has significant support on the board. He also has the formal ICW findings against him, which creates a situation where the board either acts in accordance with those findings or exposes itself to secondary ICW scrutiny." She paused. "In short, they will retain him in a modified capacity with substantially reduced autonomous authority, and they will hate every moment of agreeing to that, and that is probably the best achievable outcome given current political reality." "I know," Harry said. "Ionescu told me to expect something like that. Ionescu is perceptive." She picked up a folder. "What I want you to know, Harry, and I'm telling you this because you've earned the information, is that the investigation doesn't end here. We're following the thread of the other fragments. We're investigating the full scope of who else may have been subject to unauthorized bindings. Neville Longbottom's situation has opened a wider inquiry, and there are 3 other families currently under preliminary review. She looked at him. The thing you started, that Flitwick started, properly, it has a longer trajectory than any of us fully mapped in October. Good, Harry said. She looked at him. Are you well? Not officially. Personally. Yes, he said. I think I actually am. She held his gaze for a moment with the assessing quality she brought to everything, then nodded once. Good, she said. Then go to your classes. You've missed enough of them this term. He hadn't, actually. He'd missed a total of 6 lessons in the entire 8 weeks of this, all scheduled, all documented, all approved by Flitwick, who had the ICW authorization to pull him from scheduled sessions. His academic performance had not suffered. If anything, with each set of bindings removed, the academic performance had done the opposite of suffered. Transfiguration was the example he found most legible. Week 1, he'd been competent, solid, focused, doing the work correctly. Weeks 3 through 6, with the output suppressors gone, he'd been moving through the material at a pace that McGonagall had stopped commenting on because she'd run out of ways to comment on it that didn't sound like she was drawing attention to something she was still emotionally processing. This Monday, post-quarrel cancellation, he had a free period and then transfiguration and then charms, and he used the free period to sit in an empty classroom and practice. Not the curriculum. He'd covered the curriculum. He sat cross-legged on a desk and worked on the thing that was harder than spell work, control. Specifically, the fine-grained calibration of his ambient magical projection. He could feel it now, the natural outward pulse of what he was, and it was not subtle. Dr. Vass had removed the social suppression binding, and what had been beneath it was essentially the magical equivalent of a brass band in a library. He was present in a room in a way that was impossible to ignore for anyone with basic magical sensitivity. This was not a problem in itself. It was just information about him that he'd prefer to be able to modulate. Not suppress, that was a different thing entirely, and he had no interest in suppression ever again. But the difference between present and overwhelming was a calibration worth mastering. He worked at it for 40 minutes, pulling the projection inward gradually, finding the range between its natural state and something more considered. It was like learning to speak at conversational volume after spending your whole life only knowing how to whisper. The skill wasn't in getting quieter but in understanding the full range. By the end of the 40 minutes he had something workable. Not perfect. A work in progress, which was fine because he had years. McGonagall's class, he turned a teapot into a tortoise in 45 seconds and spent the rest of the session helping Seamus Finnegan, whose tortoise had acquired the handle as a permanent architectural feature and was deeply confused about it. Flitwick's class, he ran through the second-year charms curriculum that Flitwick had quietly provided as supplementary material because the first-year curriculum had stopped presenting any challenge around week 3. He did this at the back of the class in a way that didn't show, because there was no reason to make anyone else's lesson about him. Flitwick knew. Flitwick walked past his desk at one point and looked at the second-year material open under his first-year textbook and didn't say anything, just made a small sound of approval and kept walking. After class, when everyone else had gone, Flitwick looked at him from his desk and said, "We should talk about next year." Harry settled onto a desk edge. "What about it?" "Your progression through the standard curriculum is going to require management." "Not suppression," Flitwick added quickly, with a precision that acknowledged exactly why that word needed clarification. "Management. The question of how to structure your education appropriately, given," he paused, "given everything. You're asking if I want to be separated from my year group." "I'm asking what you want," Flitwick said. "Which is the correct question. Not what's administratively convenient." Harry thought about this. About Ron and Hermione and Neville, all of them in their first year together, building something. About the specific texture of learning alongside people rather than ahead of them. About the fact that being the most magically capable person in a room had never been the interesting part, the interesting part was what you did with other people, what you built, what you figured out together. I don't want to skip years, he said. I want to stay with my cohort. He paused. But I'd like access to advanced materials and to be allowed to work at whatever pace is natural. He paused again. And I'd like to study independently in areas the curriculum doesn't cover. Flitwick looked at him. What areas? Theoretical charms, the foundational architecture, the pre-modern sources. He paused. Soul magic theory. Specifically, my mother's framework. Flitwick was quiet for a moment. Hermione Granger has been working through your mother's correspondence. I know. We're working on it together. A pause. We'd like to formally continue that. With access to the restricted section and whatever independent correspondence is appropriate. Flitwick looked at him for a long moment. Both of you are 11. Harry looked at him steadily. Flitwick cleared his throat. I'll arrange library access. The correspondence, I'll speak to Madame Pants. The independent study framework will require documentation, but, he paused. I will handle the documentation. He looked at Harry. Anything else? Neville, Harry said. His bindings are coming off this week. When they're done, his herbology ability is apparently real and significant, and what he's going to need is someone treating it seriously rather than being surprised by it. Professor Sprout would be the right person to talk to. Flitwick blinked. Then he took out a quill and made a note. Yes. I'll speak to Pomona. He looked up. You've been paying attention to everyone around you. They're worth paying attention to, Harry said simply. Neville's final binding came off on Thursday afternoon. Gar. Vass had done them in 3 sessions across the week, staging them carefully, 9 bindings in 3 days, each session monitored, each recovery given proper time. Harry was in the corridor outside when it finished, this time not waiting as support but because he'd been passing on his way from the library when Neville came out. Neville stood in the corridor and looked at his hands. He looked different. Not physically, same round face, same Gryffindor robes, same rumpled quality. But he was standing differently. Not taller, exactly, but in himself differently. The way a door hung properly is different from a door that's been slightly off its hinges for years. Both doors. One just opens cleanly. How do you feel? Harry asked. Neville looked up. He had the expression Harry recognized from his own first sessions, that new normal quality, the adjustment to more room. Big, Neville said. Harry nodded. That doesn't go away, he said. But it normalizes. Becomes just, the right size. Neville looked at his hands again. I've been thinking about herbology, he said. You should talk to Professor Sprout. I know. I've been frightened too. He said it honestly, without performing the vulnerability of it. Because what if I'm wrong about what I can do? What if the bindings come off and I'm still, you're not, Harry said. You don't know that. I was in herbology 3 weeks ago when you identified a symptom in a devil's snare cutting that Sprout herself hadn't spotted yet, Harry said. Bound. Before any of yours came off. What do you think that looks like unbound? Neville looked at him. Go talk to Sprout, Harry said. Today. Neville squared his shoulders in the newly level way of someone whose floor had just been found solid twice in the same week. Yeah, he said. Okay. Harry watched him walk toward the greenhouses, and thought about a boy who'd been told for years that magic was hard for him specifically, and who had a natural aptitude for living things that had been pushing through 9 deliberate constraints like a plant through concrete, just because that was what it did. He went back to the library. Hermione had organized the table. This was not a surprise. Over the past 2 weeks, the corner table at the back of the library had evolved from a study spot into something more like a working research station, Lily Potter's letters arranged in chronological order under a preservation charm Hermione had learned from a 5th year, her own notes cross-referenced in a separate notebook, A growing stack of supplementary texts that Madame Pants had been producing from the restricted section with the slightly dazed expression of a librarian who had not expected to be helping two first-years with pre-modern soul magic theory but was finding it professionally interesting. Ron was there too, which said something about loyalty because Ron had zero interest in soul magic theory and considerable interest in wizard's chess, which he was giving up to sit at this table. He'd taken on a role that was essentially quality control. When Hermione or Harry produced a theory, Ron was the person who said right, but why would that matter practically, or you've lost me at the third step, which means the explanation has a hole in it. He was better at this than he appeared to be, and Harry had told him so, and Ron had said, obviously, in the tone of someone who'd known this for a while and was glad someone else had caught up. Harry sat down. Hermione pushed a piece of parchment toward him. He looked at it. "This is the structural analysis of the soul fragment containment binding," she said. "Your mother's version. I've been comparing it to what's in the literature on containment magic. There isn't much. The restricted section has 2 relevant texts and Flamel's source materials are better than either of them. But the key thing I found," she pointed to a section of the parchment, "is here." She built a decay function into the containment. Harry looked at where she was pointing. It was designed to degrade. Yes. Over time. Specifically, over 10 to 15 years, calibrated to your magical development. It was meant to hold the fragment stable until you were old enough, and then begin to fail in a controlled way that would make the fragment detectable. She paused. She designed it so that at approximately the age of 11 or 12, a competent diagnostician running a standard scan would be able to identify the fragment clearly. Harry looked up. She planned for the detection. She was setting up the circumstances for discovery. She couldn't remove the fragment herself, she didn't have time, and the tools required aren't available to a single person working under pressure. So she built a time lock. Hermione's voice had the quality it got when she was excited about something and was controlling the excitement because she wanted to communicate clearly. The diagnostic showing up clearly enough for Flitwick to find, that wasn't luck. That was your mother's framework doing exactly what she designed it to do. Harry sat back. He thought about Flamel's characterization, the most remarkable correspondence I have kept. He thought about her letter, "I hope you're free." He thought about the decay function built into a binding placed in the last hours of her life, engineered to trigger a detection window 11 years later. She'd reached 11 years into the future and handed him something. She was setting up the domino, Ron said. She couldn't knock them all down herself. So she set up the first one to fall at the right time. Yes, Harry said. Ron stopped. Looked at the parchment. That's kind of the most brilliant thing I've ever heard of. Hermione, very quietly, said, "Me too." Harry looked at the parchment for a long moment. Then he looked at both of them. "Write it up," he said. "Properly. With full citation and analysis. This is a discovery, a real one, documented and sourceable. It belongs in the record." Hermione reached for her quill. "I'll need at least a week to do it properly." "Take the time," Harry said. "Do it right." She was already writing. The Board of Governors review concluded on the Friday of the second week of December, 8 days after it had formally opened, which was faster than Amelia had predicted and suggested. She told Harry briefly in the corridor, that the political pressure she described had been applied more efficiently than expected. The outcome was roughly what Ionescu had outlined. Dumbledore retained the headmaster position. His authority over student welfare was transferred to an independent oversight body, a small committee of 3, including 1 ministry representative, 1 ICW observer, and 1 parent-elected member. Every student welfare decision of any significance required committee approval rather than headmaster discretion. Random diagnostic assessments of all students would be conducted annually by an independent examiner unaffiliated with Hogwarts staff. His supreme mugwump suspension remained pending the full ICW review, timeline unspecified. Harry read the summary Amelia gave him and thought, it's not enough and it's what was possible, and both of those things are true simultaneously. He folded the summary and put it in his pocket and went to dinner. At the head table, Dumbledore sat in his chair and served himself roast potatoes and spoke to McGonagall on his left with the appearance of ease. He had not requested a meeting with Harry since the one Harry had declined in October. He had not attempted to speak to him privately in any corridor, had not sent the silver bird message charm, had not used any of the ambient pressure mechanisms Harry had spent weeks learning to recognize. Whether that was respect or strategy, Harry didn't know. He suspected it was both, in proportions he didn't have enough information to calculate. At the Gryffindor table, Neville was talking to Hermione with an animation that Harry hadn't seen from him before, explaining something about a plant genus with his hands moving, Hermione asking questions with genuine interest, Ron listening with the expression of someone who didn't fully follow the subject but was invested in the person explaining it. The easy reciprocal engagement of a group of people who had found their rhythm. Harry poured himself pumpkin juice and let the moment be what it was. After dinner, in the corridor, Dumbledore appeared. Not engineered. Just the natural path between the Great Hall and the staircases, two people going the same direction. Dumbledore fell into step beside Harry with the unhurried naturalness of someone who had spent decades in the same building and moved through it without urgency. They walked in silence for 3 steps. "I want to tell you something," Dumbledore said, and his voice was different from its public register, quieter, without the warmth that served so many purposes. Just a voice. Not in a formal setting. Not for the record. I understand if you don't want to hear it, but I wanted to offer it. Harry kept walking. "Say it, then." "I was wrong," Dumbledore said. 3 more steps. The corridor was empty around them. Somewhere above, a ghost drifted through a wall. "Not wrong about the danger," Dumbledore continued. "The danger was real and remains real. But I was wrong about the method. I convinced myself that the decision I was making was for you, and I know now," he paused, and the pause was real, not performed, something genuinely worked through and arriving as result, "I know now that it was a decision made about you. That distinction matters more than I allowed it to." Harry walked. "I don't expect you to forgive it," Dumbledore said. "I don't think that's a reasonable thing to expect." "It's not," Harry said. "I do want you to know that it won't happen again. Not because the ICW has mechanisms in place to prevent it, although it does, but because I understand, with more clarity than I have had for some time, that there is a difference between caring about someone's outcome and respecting their capacity to choose it." He paused. "I'm still learning that difference at an age where I should have learned it long ago." They reached the staircase. Harry stopped. He turned and looked at Dumbledore directly, the way he'd looked at him in the tribunal room, seeing all of it, the genuine regret and the genuine capacity that had been misdirected and the genuine love for this institution and its people that had somehow coexisted with what he'd done. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," Harry said. "Because it's not fine, and I think you know that." He paused. "But I also know it's not all you are. And those two things are going to have to live alongside each other for both of us." Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. Something in the old face did something that was not quite any of the things it usually did, not the warm authority or the calculating wisdom or the composed dignity. Something more stripped back. Something that was just a person looking at the consequence of his own actions and sitting with it. "That is," Dumbledore said quietly, "more generous than I deserve." "Probably," Harry said. "I'm going upstairs." He went upstairs. The last week of term before Christmas break had the quality of things winding down and things beginning simultaneously, and Harry moved through it with the specific attention of someone who understood that both were true and found the combination interesting rather than unsettling. He sat his end-of-term charms assessment and turned in a paper on oscillating enchantments that was technically a first-year assessment and substantively drew from second- and third-year theory in ways that he'd integrated smoothly enough that it read as natural rather than showing off. Flitwick marked it with a grade and a footnote that said, in very small writing, "The section on harmonic resonance in layered charm structures is correct and has not previously been framed this way in the literature. Keep that observation." He sat transfiguration, sat herbology, sat potions, which remained unpleasant due to Snape's characteristic approach of teaching through selective humiliation, though Harry noticed that Snape treated him with a specific brand of complicated antagonism that was different from what he gave Neville or Seamus, something more like a man trying to determine the dimensions of an unknown object by poking it from different angles. He'd thought about Snape. The man was not simple, nobody in this castle was, apparently, which said something either about Hogwarts specifically or about people in general, and Harry was inclined toward the latter. Snape had been a Death Eater and was now on Dumbledore's side and had complicated feelings about Harry's father that he appeared to be projecting with considerable force onto Harry, and he was also, objectively, an exceptionally skilled potioneer who taught with rigorous precision under the aggressive contempt, and the potions they made in his class were correct in a way they wouldn't have been in a less demanding classroom. Harry had decided to deal with Snape the way he dealt with most complex things: notice it clearly, file it accurately, engage when necessary, and not waste energy on it otherwise. On the Wednesday before term ended, Harry went to see Flitwick for the independent study planning session they'd scheduled. Flitwick had set up a small working space at the back of his office, a second desk, properly sized, a wall shelf already bearing a selection of advanced charms texts with bookmarks inserted, and a folder of notes about the independent study framework he drafted for the board's approval. Harry looked at the wall shelf. Picked up one of the texts. It was a treatise on pre-modern charms theory from the 15th century, in Latin, with annotation in 3 different hands across the margins. He opened it and read a passage and felt the new geometric comprehension that the removed bindings had given him engage with the text the way a key engages with a lock, not laboriously, not translationally, but directly. "This is right," he said. "I thought it might be," Flitwick said. "Can I take these for the holiday?" "That's why they're there." Harry looked at him. Flitwick was on his stool, tea in hand, wearing an expression that was professional and genuine simultaneously, a mentor who had found the thing his men needed and set it in front of them without announcement. "Thank you," Harry said. "For all of it. Not just this. The whole thing." Flitwick looked at the desk surface for a moment. Then up. "You know," he said, "in 35 years of teaching, I have run that diagnostic on several hundred students. I have found minor blocks, minor impediments, the occasional inherited suppression that someone's family had never thought to mention." He paused. "I have never found anything like what I found on you. And I have asked myself, since October, what I would have done if what I found had been less severe. If it had been 5 bindings instead of 31. If the signatures had been less obviously significant." He paused again. "I like to believe I would have done the same thing. I'm not entirely certain." "I think you would have," Harry said. "You can't know that." "I know that you spent one night deciding," Harry said. "And then you sent the letter." "One night. And what was in it was enough. Whatever the number had been." He paused. "I think the deciding was already done before you ran the diagnostic. You just needed the occasion." Flitwick was quiet. Then he said, "That is a very kind thing to say." "It's accurate," Harry said. "Same thing, in this case." He gathered the books and went back to Gryffindor Tower to pack for Christmas. The last evening before the break, the common room was the particular organized chaos of 60 students packing, arguing about whose socks were whose, sending last-minute letters, and having the kind of conversations that happened when people were about to be separated for 2 weeks and were running through everything they hadn't said yet. Harry sat in the window seat, which had become definitively his spot over the course of the term, and was writing a letter. To Flamel. He'd been drafting it for 3 days and this was the version he was going to send. He thanked him for the work in the prepared room, for the letters, for being the person his mother had chosen to trust with the most important year of her research. He told him what Hermione had found, the decay function, the detection trigger, the design domino, and he asked if Flamel had known, and if not, whether he was as unsurprised as Harry thought he'd be. He also asked about the other Horcruxes. Not for information he didn't have standing to receive, not to try to insert himself into an adult investigation. Just to indicate that he knew they existed and that he intended to be part of their resolution when the time was appropriate, and that the time being appropriate was a thing he could determine for himself. He sealed it, handed it to his owl, and watched her go out the window into the cold December dark. "Who was that to?" Ron asked, dropping into the chair nearby. "Flamel. Just, casually. You're corresponding with Nicholas Flamel. He writes back. He's good at it, actually. Very concise." Ron stared at him. "He's 600 years old." 665, Harry said. "And you're writing him letters." He wrote to Hermione too, after she sent him the research note. Ron turned to look at Hermione across the room, who was carefully packaging the copies of Lily's letters in a protective case she'd commissioned from a Ravenclaw 6th year who did specialist bookbinding. He turned back. "You know," he said slowly, "a month ago this was a normal school." "Was it?" Harry said. Ron thought about it. "The troll was on Halloween," he said. "Week 1, basically." "No." He sat back. "No, it wasn't." "It's a good school, though," Harry said. "Yeah," Ron said. "It is." Neville appeared from the dormitory stairs with his trunk, nudged it against the wall, and came and sat on the floor near the fireplace with his herbology notes and a copy of 1000 Magical Herbs and Fungi that had been living in his bag for 3 weeks and was now covered in small annotation in his hand. He'd spoken to Sprout the day after his bindings finished coming off. She'd looked at his answers to a set of diagnostic questions she'd asked every student in the first week and then looked at his subsequent performance and then looked at him directly and said, "Mr. Longbottom, I owe you an apology for not finding this sooner," in a voice that was very Sprout, brisk and warm and entirely sincere. Neville had gone slightly pink and then asked her something about propagation theory and they'd been in the greenhouse for 2 hours. "Gran's coming to collect me herself," Neville said to the room at large. "Which means she has things to say and she wants to say them in person and not in a letter." "Is she coming to the platform or?" Ron asked. "No, she's coming here." Neville looked up from his notes. "She wrote to Professor Sprout as well. And to Flitwick." He paused. "I think she's conducting a survey." "Of the school?" "Of everyone who did or didn't notice what was happening to me," Neville said, with the equanimity of someone who had had time to understand that their grandmother's version of processing an injustice was thorough and targeted and would conclude with someone having been substantially held to account. "She's building her own file." "She'd get along with Amelia Bones," Hermione said, without looking up from her packaging. "They've met twice this week," Neville said. "I think they're friends now." Ron looked at Harry with the expression of someone encountering a logical outcome they should have predicted. Harry looked back with the expression of someone who had already filed this under inevitable. Thursday morning, King's Cross, the Hogwarts Express waiting in the particular way of large things that had somewhere to be. Harry stood on the platform with his trunk and his owl's cage and his stack of Flitwick's books in his bag, and he looked at the train and then at the station beyond the barrier and thought about the summer. About going back to the Dursleys. Amelia had addressed this. Quickly, efficiently, in the way she addressed everything. The living arrangement with the Dursleys was under formal review as part of the child welfare assessment, a Muggle family with no magical knowledge, Harry living in a cupboard under the stairs for the first 10 years of his life, no adequate supervision from a magical perspective, and the blood ward protections that Dumbledore had placed there now documented and notarized in a context that made their validity legally questionable. She'd told him this 3 days ago and told him not to worry about it this holiday because the review would take longer than 1 term and in the meantime there were options. Options like what? He'd asked. The Wisengamot has a formal process for magical guardianship review, she'd said. Which I've already initiated. I wouldn't expect results before spring, but I wouldn't expect you to go back to the Dursleys for next summer either. A pause. You have people in your corner, Harry. Use that phrase loosely, I mean it institutionally, legally, and in several other ways. He'd thought about what she meant by several other ways, and he'd thought about Ron's family, who he'd heard about in several contexts this term, and every context suggested a house that was chaotic and warm and entirely unconcerned with whether you were useful before they were kind to you. He'd thought about Neville's grandmother, who was currently building her own file with Amelia Bones and who had, apparently, written to Harry's welfare case with the specific note that Neville considered him a close friend and that she hoped appropriate arrangements would be made. He'd thought about Flamel's letters. He'd thought about the castle, warm and vast, which would be here when he came back. He was pulled out of this by Ron appearing at his elbow and saying, "Mum's here. She wants to, do you want to?" He stopped and started again more directly. "She'd like to meet you. She's been reading things." "Reading things?" "You know. Things. Things about, the whole," Ron gestured comprehensively at the general situation. "The whole situation." "Yeah." Ron paused. "She also heard about the troll, because Fred told George who told Percy who told her, because nothing in our family is private for more than 48 hours. He looked at Harry carefully. "She's, you know, she's very," he stopped. "Molly," Harry said, having paid attention. "Yeah. She's very Molly about things. Good Molly. Not alarming Molly." Ron paused. "The lines are sometimes close. Forewarned." Harry looked across the platform. A woman in a set of burgundy robes was organizing 5 children with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it for years, her hair the same warm red as Ron's, her attention scattered productively across multiple simultaneous concerns. She was also, simultaneously, keeping track of where Harry was on the platform without looking directly at him, in the specific way that people who were worried about someone kept track of them while trying not to appear to be tracking them. He walked over. She turned when he was close, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who had read things and felt them and was deciding on the spot what the right register was for this specific moment, not pity, not overwarmth, not the specific performance of sympathy that adults sometimes defaulted to around children who'd had difficult things happen. Something more simply human than that. "Harry," she said. "Mrs. Weasley," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached out and put her hand briefly on his shoulder, just a touch, brief and direct and communicating nothing complicated, just "I see you, you're here, it's fine. Ron says you're doing well," she said. "I am," he said. "Good," she said, in the tone of someone who needed that to be true and was glad it was. She looked at his trunk. "Have you got someone to go home to? For the holiday?" Harry thought about the Dursleys. "Of a sort," he said. She clearly filed this as insufficient but had the wisdom to not press it at a train platform with 8 people around her. "You're welcome at ours," she said instead. "Any time. There's always room, regardless of what Fred says about the attic." "There really isn't," Fred said, from 3 feet away where he'd been listening without apology. "There is," she said firmly. "Harry, I mean it." "Thank you," Harry said. He meant it across several registers at once, the way he'd meant things recently, clearly and without ambiguity and with the full understanding that the offer was genuine and that the person making it knew something about what genuine offers were worth. The whistle sounded. People started moving for the doors. Harry picked up his trunk, settled his bag, checked his owl was secure. He felt the platform under his feet and the winter cold and the particular noise and press of a station, and he felt himself in it, present, clear, real. All of it available. Hermione appeared at his right. Neville at his left, Augusta Longbottom a dignified distance behind him and already engaged in what looked like a purposeful conversation with Flitwick on the platform, both of them referring to a document that might have been the independent study framework or might have been her file. Possibly both. Ron fell into step from somewhere and said, "Come on then." They got on the train. The Scottish countryside rolled past the windows in its winter registration, bare hills, grey sky, the occasional village wrapped in frost. The compartment had 4 of them and a chess game and Hermione's notebook and a bag of chocolate frogs that Ron's mother had pressed on all of them at the last moment with the specific generosity of someone who fed people as a primary expression of caring. Harry sat by the window and watched the landscape move and ate a chocolate frog and thought about the term behind him. 8 weeks. 31 bindings, 1 soul fragment, 1 tribunal, 1 board review, 1 set of parents taking form from names into something real and specific and irretrievably his. 1 set of friends built from scratch, from nothing, from being put in the same school on the same night and choosing each other with the accumulated evidence of 2 months. He thought about what was ahead. The other Horcruxes, somewhere in the world, waiting to be found. Voldemort, diminished but not gone. Dumbledore, in his modified position, learning the difference between protection and control at 612 years old. The investigation that Ionescu had set in motion, unspooling through the European wizarding world. His mother's framework, in Hermione's careful hands, waiting to be continued. His own work, the calibration of what he was, the independent study, the specific joy of magic done at its full expression, all the things that had been waiting behind 31 locked doors. He thought about Flamel's question, "Are you frightened?" He thought about his own answer and found it still accurate. No. Not of any of it. Not of the work ahead or the enemies that remained or the politics that would grind on regardless, not of being known or seen or fully present in a world that had spent 11 years trying to make him smaller. He was interested. He was engaged. He was, in the specific and irreducible sense, himself. Ron was losing a chess game to Hermione, which was unusual enough that he was arguing about the methodology rather than the result. Neville had fallen asleep against the window with his herbology book open on his lap, his face relaxed in sleep into something that had no flinching in it. The train moved north into the grey December sky. Harry turned away from the window and reached into his bag and pulled out the 15th-century charms treatise, the one in Latin with the 3-handed marginalia, and opened it to where he'd left off, and read. The world outside moved past. The compartment was warm. His friends were around him. He was unbound, fully, for the first time in his life, and everything that came next was his to move toward. He turned a page.